She stood in the doorway, trembling, not from the Wyoming cold, but from shame that had carved itself into her bones. "No one marries a fat girl, sir, but I can cook," Hazel whispered, waiting for the laughter that always came. But Rowan K. didn't laugh. He didn't look away. Instead, he said 7 words that would shatter everything she believed about herself. "Then show me what survival tastes like." This is the story of a woman the world tried to break, and the rancher who saw her strength when she couldn't. Stay with me until the end, and comment what city you're watching from so I can see how far Hazel's story travels across this world. The winter of 1879 came to Wyoming Territory like a wolf, silent, patient, and merciless. It didn't announce itself with drama. It simply arrived one November morning and decided to stay, settling over the land with the weight of something that knew it couldn't be fought, only endured. In a cabin 3 miles south of Powder Creek, where the cottonwoods grew thick enough to hide a woman who wanted to disappear, Hazel Boone woke before dawn like she always did. Not because she had anywhere to be, not because anyone was waiting, but because sleeping past sunrise felt like admitting defeat, and Hazel had spent 27 years refusing to surrender completely. She rose in the dark, her joints protesting the cold that had seeped through every crack in the cabin walls during the night. The floorboards creaked under her weight, that familiar sound that had followed her since childhood, the sound that announced her before she entered a room, that made children whisper and women smirk, and men look away as if her very existence embarrassed them. The mirror above her wash basin had a crack running through it like a lightning bolt. Hazel avoided looking at it most days, but this morning something made her pause. The face that looked back was round and plain, framed by brown hair she kept tied back because it was easier than trying to make it pretty. Her eyes were the color of creek water after rain, gray-green and unremarkable. Her body was exactly what people said it was. Too much. Too wide, too soft, too present in a world that preferred women to take up less space. The fat girl by the river, they'd called her in town. Never to her face after she turned 16 and her father, God rest him, had threatened to break the jaw of any man who spoke ill of his daughter where he could hear it. But she'd heard the whispers anyway, had felt them like spider webs across her skin every time she walked through Clearmont's single dusty street. She poured cold water from the pitcher into the basin and washed her face, the shock of it driving away the last remnants of sleep. Her hands were the only part of herself she liked, strong, capable, scarred in places from years of kitchen work. These hands had fed her father through his final illness. These hands had kept her alive through 2 winters alone. These hands knew the difference between survival and living, even if the rest of her had forgotten. The cabin was small but clean. Hazel couldn't abide mess. Her father had taught her that dignity wasn't about what you had, but about how you kept what little you possessed. So the floor was swept, the single room organized with military precision. Her cot in one corner with its thin mattress and carefully mended quilts. The cast-iron stove that ate through firewood like a hungry beast. The shelf with her father's books, 7 of them, which made her richer than half the territory in her mind. And her kitchen corner where she kept her real treasures, the spices she'd bartered for, the sourdough starter she'd kept alive for 3 years, the collection of cast-iron skillets seasoned to black perfection. She built up the fire and set coffee to boil. The beans were running low. Everything was running low. Winter had another 3 months to go, maybe 4, and her supplies wouldn't last. She'd been rationing since December, but mathematics didn't care about careful planning. Numbers were honest in a way people rarely were. The coffee filled the cabin with its bitter perfume, and Hazel poured herself a cup, wrapping both hands around the tin mug to steal its warmth. She'd need to go into town soon. The thought sat in her stomach like a stone. Town meant eyes. Town meant whispers. Town meant Mrs. Granger at the general store weighing every item with theatrical size, as if Hazel's purchases personally offended her. Town meant young girls giggling behind their hands and young men looking through her like she was made of glass. But town also meant survival, so she'd go. Just not today. She was measuring out cornmeal for breakfast, a Johnny cake, small because the bag was nearly empty, when she heard it. Hoofbeats. Coming up the path toward her cabin. Hazel froze, the measuring cup suspended in her hand. No one came out here. Not the postman, who considered 3 miles too far for a woman with no family and no social standing. Not the neighbors, because she had none. Not the townfolk, who'd made it clear she was welcome to stay, disappeared. The hoofbeats stopped. A knock followed, firm, but not aggressive. 3 measured raps against wood. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She set down the cornmeal and wiped her hands on her apron, the old blue one, stained and patched but still serviceable. Her mind raced through possibilities. Debt collectors, though she owed nothing. Drifters, though most avoided cabins with smoke coming from the chimney. Missionaries, though they usually traveled in pairs and announced themselves with excessive cheerfulness. Miss Boone? The voice was male, deep, with the kind of resonance that suggested a chest like a barrel. Miss Hazel Boone? She moved to the door but didn't open it. Who's asking? Name's Rowan Cade. I own the ranch about 8 miles northwest. I'm hoping you might spare a few minutes for conversation. Rowan Cade. She knew the name, though they'd never met. Everyone in the territory knew about Cade Ranch. It had started as a small operation 10 years back and grown into something formidable. 5,000 acres, maybe more, with cattle that somehow survived winters that killed off weaker herds. People spoke of Cade with the kind of respect usually reserved for forces of nature. Hard but fair, they said. A man who paid his debts and expected the same in return. What in God's name did Rowan Cade want with her? Hazel's hand went to her hair instinctively, then stopped. It didn't matter. Whatever this was, it wasn't social. She opened the door. The man standing on her small porch was tall, well over 6 feet, with shoulders that seemed to challenge the doorframe itself. He wore a heavy coat dark with trail dust, and his hat was pulled low enough that she couldn't see his eyes clearly. His face was weathered in that way that made age impossible to guess. Could be 35, could be 50. His jaw was dark with several days' stubble, and there was a scar that ran from his left temple down to his cheekbone, white against tanned skin. He removed his hat. Miss Boone, I apologize for the intrusion. His eyes were blue, the pale, cold blue of February ice. But they didn't look through her the way most men's did. They looked at her directly, assessing but not judging, or at least not in the way she'd learned to recognize. Mr. Cade? She kept her voice neutral, her body blocking the doorway. It's early for visiting. It is, he agreed, and I wouldn't have come if the matter wasn't pressing. He glanced past her into the cabin, then back at her face. May I speak plainly? I prefer it. Something that might have been respect flickered across his expression. I need a cook. A real one. I've got 20 hands working my ranch, and the man I hired to feed them walked off 3 days ago after an argument involving a fence post and another man's wife. The hands are eating hardtack and whatever they can burn over an open fire. In about a week, I'll have a mutiny on my property. Hazel blinked. Of all the things she'd imagined this conversation might be about, this hadn't made the list. You want to hire me? I do. You don't know me, Mr. Cade. I know you've kept yourself alive out here for 2 years since your father passed. I know people in town say you can make a meal out of nothing and have it taste like something. I know you don't drink, don't gossip, and don't start trouble. He paused. I also know you're likely running low on supplies and that pride's expensive in winter. Heat crept up her neck. He'd done his research then, asked about her. The thought made her feel exposed in a way that had nothing to do with the cold. And what did people tell you about what I look like, Mr. Cade? His expression didn't change. That you're fat. The word hit like a slap, even though she'd been expecting it, even though she'd heard it 1,000 times. There was something about hearing it stated so baldly, without euphemism or whisper, that made it worse. She started to close the door. Then you know why this won't work. I appreciate the offer, but his hand stopped the door, not roughly, but firmly. Miss Boone, I need someone who can cook. I don't need someone decorative. I've got cattle for that, and they're considerably less trouble. He met her eyes. I pay $40 a month plus room and board. You'd have your own quarters, small cabin behind the main house. Meals and supplies provided. Work starts before dawn and doesn't end till the hands are fed dinner. It's hard work. $40. Hazel's breath caught. She made maybe $8 a month selling preserves and doing occasional laundry for people too proud to admit they'd hired the fat girl for anything. $40 would mean security, would mean choices. would mean not having to weigh whether coffee or flour was more essential. But it also meant being stared at, being judged, being the entertainment for 20 ranch hands who'd probably never seen a woman like her doing anything but being laughed at. "Mr. Cade," she said slowly, "I appreciate that you need someone, but let's be honest about what this would be. I'd be cooking for men who'll make jokes about me, who'll call me names, who'll wonder why you hired someone who looks like I do when there are prettier girls in town who can boil water." "Then they can make their own meals," he said flatly. "Any man on my ranch who disrespects my cook answers to me personally. And Miss Boone, I'm not a patient man when it comes to stupidity." She studied him, trying to understand his angle. Men didn't do things like this without reason. "Why me? Really?" He was quiet for a long moment, his pale eyes holding hers. Finally, he said, "You know what it's like to be hungry, not just for food, for purpose, for mattering, for waking up and having a reason to face the day." His voice was low, almost rough. "I need someone who'll cook like they understand that food isn't just fuel. It's the only warmth some men get, the only softness in a hard life. I need someone who'll cook like it matters." Something in Hazel's chest cracked open, just a little, just enough to hurt. This man she'd never met had somehow seen through to the thing she'd been hiding even from herself, that she was starving, but not for bread. "I can cook," she heard herself say. The words came out barely above a whisper. "But Mr. Cade, no one marries a fat girl, sir. And I've learned not to expect—" "I'm not hiring a wife," he interrupted, his voice gentle but firm. "I'm hiring someone who can remind a man life's worth waking up for." The words hung in the cold air between them, almost visible, like breath turned to frost. Hazel felt something inside her that had been frozen for years begin, impossibly, to thaw. "When would you need me to start?" "Tomorrow. Dawn." "That's fast." "I'm desperate." The corner of his mouth lifted slightly. "Though I'd appreciate if you didn't share that detail with the hands. Bad for authority." Despite herself, despite everything, Hazel felt a smile tug at her own mouth. "I'll need to pack, and I'll want to see the kitchen before I agree to anything. If it's a disaster, Mr. Cade, $40 won't be enough." "Fair." He settled his hat back on his head. "I'll send a wagon at first light. Bring whatever you need. If the kitchen doesn't meet standards, I'll have it rebuilt." He turned to leave, then paused. "Miss Boone? One more thing." "Yes?" "On my ranch, people earn their names. Until someone proves themselves worth knowing, I call them by their work. But after that?" His blue eyes were steady. "After that, they're family. And family doesn't let family go hungry. Not for food, and not for respect." He left before she could respond, mounting a bay horse that had been waiting patiently. Hazel watched him ride away, his figure growing smaller against the white landscape until he disappeared entirely. She closed the door and leaned against it, her heart racing. $40 a month. A purpose. A place where food might matter, where her cooking might mean something beyond simple survival. It was terrifying. It was impossible. It was the first time in 2 years she'd felt something other than numb. Hazel looked around her cabin, at the careful poverty, the organized desperation, the life she'd built out of scraps and stubbornness. Then she looked at her hands, those capable, scarred hands that knew how to take nothing and make it enough. "All right then," she said to the empty room. "Let's see what you're made of." She spent the rest of the day packing. Not her clothes. She had 3 dresses, all of them practical, all of them carefully mended where the seams had given way under the stress of her body. Not her personal items. There were almost none, except her father's books and a photograph of her parents on their wedding day, both of them young and unaware of what disappointment their daughter would become. No, Hazel packed her kitchen. She wrapped each cast iron skillet in cloth like they were made of precious metal, because to her they were. She carefully transferred her sourdough starter into a clean jar, the mixture that had survived 2 winters and dozens of batches of bread. She packed her spices in small tins, the cinnamon she'd bartered for with 3 jars of apple butter, the black pepper that had cost her a week's worth of laundry, the dried herbs she'd gathered and hung in her cabin every summer. These were her tools, her weapons, her proof that she was worth something. As she worked, her mind raced with possibilities. 20 men to feed, 3 meals a day. That meant she'd need to plan for quantity without sacrificing quality. Would need to think about nutrition. These were men who worked from dawn to dusk in brutal conditions. They'd need protein, fat, calories, but they'd also need variety, or they'd grow restless and ungrateful. Breakfast could be simple but substantial: eggs if there were chickens, biscuits with gravy, bacon or salt pork, coffee strong enough to wake the dead. Lunch would need to be portable for men in the field: sandwiches maybe, or hand pies that could be eaten while working. Dinner was where she could show what she was capable of: stews that had been cooking all day, roasts if there was beef, bread fresh from the oven, desserts that made hard men remember they were human. She could do this. She knew she could. But knowing and believing were different things. That night, Hazel barely slept. She lay in her cot, listening to the wind test the cabin's walls, and let herself imagine a different life. A kitchen that was more than a corner. Men who ate what she made and didn't turn it into a joke about her size. Work that mattered enough to be paid for, to be respected for. And Rowan Cade's words playing over and over in her mind: "I'm hiring someone who can remind a man life's worth waking up for." When had anyone suggested her life was worth anything at all? Dawn came cold and gray, the sun more suggestion than presence behind the thick winter clouds. Hazel rose, dressed in her warmest dress, the brown one that made her look like a tree trunk, but at least it was clean, and finished her packing. She made coffee, drank it standing at her window, watching the path for the wagon she half expected wouldn't come. But it did. At exactly first light, a wagon rolled up her path. The driver was a young man, maybe 20, with red hair that stuck out from under his hat, and a face full of freckles. He climbed down and approached her door with the kind of swagger young men have before life teaches them caution. "Miss Boone?" He touched his hat brim. "Name's Quinn. Mr. Cade sent me to fetch you." "I'm ready." She gestured to her packed belongings. "It's not much." Quinn loaded everything into the wagon with efficiency, though she saw him glance at her collection of cookware with obvious curiosity. "You're the new cook, then?" "Apparently." Thank God. He said it with such fervent relief that Hazel almost smiled. "Begging your pardon, ma'am, but we've been eating beans and hardtack for 3 days. Jenkins tried to make biscuits yesterday and nearly broke Thompson's tooth." "That bad?" "Worse. Thompson threatened to shoot Jenkins. Mr. Cade threatened to shoot both of them if they didn't shut up and get back to work." Quinn helped her up onto the wagon seat. "You any good?" Hazel settled herself, very aware of how the wagon seat groaned under her weight. "I suppose we'll find out." The ride to Cade Ranch took just over an hour. Quinn talked the entire time, about the ranch, about the other hands, about how Mr. Cade had built everything from nothing after the war, about the winter they'd lost 200 head of cattle and somehow survived anyway. He talked like someone who'd been quiet too long and had words backed up like water behind a dam. Hazel let him talk. She was too busy watching the landscape change from scattered homesteads to open range, from lonely to merely empty. The land here was brutal in its honesty. It didn't pretend to be anything but hard. But there was beauty in the harshness, in the way the snow caught the weak sunlight, in the dark line of mountains against the pale sky. "There she is," Quinn said finally, pointing. "Cade Ranch." Hazel's first thought was that it was bigger than she'd imagined. The main house was 2 stories, solid and square, built from logs that had been chinked with such care that not a single gap showed. There were several outbuildings, a barn large enough to house a small village, what looked like a bunkhouse, various sheds and coops. Smoke rose from multiple chimneys. Cattle dotted the fields beyond, dark shapes against white snow. Her second thought was that this was real. She was really here. Really about to walk into a world full of men who'd judge her before she opened her mouth. "Kitchen's attached to the main house," Quinn explained, guiding the wagon around to the back. "Your cabin's just there. See it? The small one with the green door. Mr. Cade had it cleaned out yesterday." The cabin was small, maybe a quarter the size of the one she'd left, but it looked solid. The green door was cheerful against the weathered wood. Windows on 2 sides, a chimney promising a stove inside. Quinn helped her down and started unloading her belongings. Hazel stood for a moment, just breathing, trying to settle her nerves. Then she squared her shoulders and walked toward the main house, toward the kitchen, toward whatever waited for her there. The door wasn't locked. She pushed it open and stepped into warmth, blessed, beautiful warmth from a stove that was already lit. The kitchen was easily 4 times the size of her entire previous cabin. There was a massive cast iron stove with 6 burners and 2 ovens, counters that ran along 2 walls, shelves stocked with supplies, flour, sugar, salt, coffee, beans, dried goods she couldn't even identify from where she stood. A larder door that probably led to more, windows that would let in morning light, hooks on the walls for pots and pans, a work table in the center, scarred and solid. It was beautiful. It was terrifying. Acceptable? Hazel jumped, spinning around. Rowan Cade stood in the doorway connecting the kitchen to the rest of the house. He'd cleaned up since yesterday. His face was shaved, his hair combed back, his shirt clean. But his eyes were the same. That pale, assessing blue. She struggled for words. It's more than acceptable, Mr. Cade. Good. He moved into the kitchen, his presence somehow making the large space feel smaller. Supplies are restocked weekly. If you need something specific, make a list. I've got accounts in Clearmont and Buffalo. The hands eat breakfast at 6, lunch is brought out to them in the field, dinner at 7. You'll have help with serving and cleanup. I'm not expecting miracles. Hazel moved to the stove, running her hand over its surface, still warm from morning's fire. What happened to your last cook? Couldn't keep his hands to himself. Cade's voice went flat. Thought one of the younger hands was interested, was wrong. I gave him 5 minutes to pack and 5 seconds to get off my land. And the one before that? Drunk. Fell asleep and nearly burned down the kitchen. He paused. Miss Boone, I'll be clear. This job is hard. The men are rough. They work like dogs and expect to be fed accordingly. They'll test you, see if you can keep up, see if you'll break. But if you can cook, if you can handle the pressure, you'll have security here. And respect, once you earn it. And if I can't? The question came out smaller than she intended. If I'm not good enough? He looked at her steadily. Are you good enough? It was the question she'd been asking herself for 27 years. The question that kept her small, kept her hidden, kept her safe but suffocating. Hazel thought of her sourdough starter, still alive after years of care. Thought of the meals she'd stretched to feed her father through his final months. Thought of every time she'd taken scraps and turned them into something worth eating, worth savoring. She met Rowan Cade's eyes. Yes, she said. I am. Something in his expression shifted. Not quite a smile, but close. Then show me. Breakfast is in 2 hours. 21 men, counting myself. Impress us. He left before she could respond, the door swinging shut behind him. Hazel stood alone in her new kingdom, her heart hammering. 21 men, 2 hours. Her first test. She rolled up her sleeves. Time to remind them what living tasted like. 2 hours wasn't much time, but Hazel had learned long ago that desperation made the best teacher. She moved through the kitchen like a woman possessed, her hands working while her mind calculated portions, timing, possibilities. The pantry revealed treasures, smoked bacon hanging from hooks, eggs by the dozen, cream so thick it barely poured, butter wrapped in cloth, potatoes stored in barrels. Whoever had stocked this kitchen understood that feeding working men required fuel, not fancy. She decided on a gamble. Not the safe choice of simple scrambled eggs and bacon, not the expected biscuits that every ranch cook from here to Montana could make in their sleep. If these men were going to judge her, and they would, then she'd give them something worth remembering. Hazel started with the bacon, laying thick strips across the stovetop to render slowly. While the fat liquefied and the meat crisped, she mixed cornmeal with flour, eggs, buttermilk, and a secret, a spoonful of the bacon drippings, still hot. The batter came together silky and golden. She poured it into a massive cast-iron skillet that had been heating, and the sizzle that filled the kitchen was like a promise being made. But cornbread alone, even perfect cornbread, wouldn't be enough. She needed something that would make hard men stop, pay attention, remember they had taste buds that could experience pleasure instead of just fuel. She needed alchemy. The cream went into a pan with more bacon fat, a generous grinding of black pepper, a whisper of smoked paprika she'd found in the spice collection. She stirred it constantly, watching it thicken, tasting it with her finger until the salt and smoke and heat balanced on her tongue like a song. When the cornbread came out of the oven, golden and crispy at the edges, she cut it into squares still steaming and drowned each piece in the cream sauce. The bacon she crumbled on top, along with a scatter of green onions she'd discovered in a cold box. It looked like peasant food. It smelled like heaven. She made coffee in a pot big enough to bathe a child in, strong and bitter and honest. She scrambled 24 eggs with cheese and more of those green onions. She sliced bread, yesterday's, but she toasted it over the stove flame until it crackled. By the time the clock showed 6, she'd set out everything on the long table in the dining hall attached to the kitchen, and her dress was soaked with sweat despite the winter cold. Then she heard them coming. The sound hit her first, boots on wood, rough laughter, voices still rough with sleep and cold. They came through the door in a wave of bodies and noise. 20 men who'd spent their lives doing hard things and expected no softness in return. They were young and old, scarred and whole, but they all had the same look in their eyes when they saw her standing by the kitchen door. The laughter died. The talking stopped. Every single one of them stared. Hazel felt her face flush hot. Here it was, the moment she'd been dreading, the judgment, the whispers that would start. That's the cook? Her? Cade must be desperate. Look at the size of her. Bet she eats half of what she makes. Wonder if the table will hold if she sits down. A man near the front, older with a gray beard and eyes like flint, opened his mouth. Well, I'll be... Sit down and eat. Rowan Cade's voice cut through the room like a blade. He'd appeared from the main house, and every man in the room straightened slightly at his presence. Miss Boone's been working while you've been sleeping. Show some gratitude. They sat, quickly, quietly, like schoolboys caught misbehaving. Hazel served, moving along the table with platters, trying not to meet anyone's eyes. She set the cornbread and cream sauce in the center, the scrambled eggs at each end, the bacon and toast in between. Poured coffee into cups with hands that trembled slightly. The men watched her, and she could feel their thoughts like brands against her skin. Then someone took a bite. The silence that followed was different. Hazel was back in the kitchen doorway, her heart hammering when she heard it, the scrape of fork against plate. Then another. Then the sound of chewing, of swallowing, of someone reaching for seconds before they'd finished firsts. Christ almighty, someone breathed. Where'd you learn to cook like this? Another voice asked. Shut up and eat before Thompson takes your share, a third man said, and there was actual laughter in his voice. Hazel dared to look. Every man at that table was eating like he'd forgotten food could taste like something. The cornbread disappeared first, squares soaked in cream sauce vanishing into mouths that had forgotten to sneer. The eggs went next. Then the bacon. The toast. Men reached for seconds, thirds, with a desperation that had nothing to do with hunger and everything to do with memory, with suddenly recalling that meals could be more than fuel. At the head of the table, Rowan Cade ate slowly, methodically, but she caught him glance at her once. He didn't smile, but something in his eyes said he'd known. He'd known she could do this. Within 20 minutes, the platters were empty. Grown men sat back in their chairs with the stunned expressions of people who'd been ambushed by satisfaction. The gray-bearded man who'd started to speak earlier stood up, walked to the kitchen doorway where Hazel stood, and stuck out his hand. Name's Dutch, he said. Been working ranches for 30 years. That's the best damn breakfast I've had in 20 of them. Hazel took his hand, surprised by the firmness of his grip. Thank you. No, ma'am. Thank you. He turned to the rest of the men. Any of you idiots got something to say to the lady? A chorus of thanks, mumbled and awkward but sincere, filled the room. Men nodded at her as they filed out, returning to work with bellies full and something like wonder still on their faces. They didn't mock her. They didn't make jokes. They just looked at her like she'd given them something precious. When the last man had left, only Rowan remained. He stood up, gathered his plate and cup, and brought them to the kitchen. Hazel moved to take them from him, but he shook his head. You cooked, he said. I'll clean up. Mr. Cade, that's not necessary. It is. He rolled up his sleeves, revealing forearms corded with muscle and scarred from years of hard work. You fed them something that made them remember they're human. Least I can do is wash a few dishes. Hazel watched, astonished, as this man who owned thousands of acres and employed 20 hands stood at her sink and washed dishes with the same methodical efficiency he seemed to apply to everything. They worked in silence. She cleared the table, he washed, she dried and put away. It was strangely intimate, this quiet work side by side, and Hazel found herself hyper-aware of his presence, of how small the kitchen felt with him in it. "The cornbread," he said finally. "What made it so good?" "Bacon fat in the batter," she admitted. "And the cream sauce, it's just cream, more bacon fat, black pepper, and smoked paprika. Nothing fancy." It tasted fancy. He handed her a clean plate. "You learned that from your father." "From necessity. When you don't have much, you learn to make what you have count." He nodded slowly, and she had the sense he understood more than she'd said. When the last dish was clean and put away, he dried his hands on a towel and looked at her directly. "You did good, Miss Boone. Better than good." The praise made something in her chest ache. "Thank you. Lunch needs to be ready by noon. Sandwiches, something portable. Whatever you think best." He paused at the door. "And Miss Boone, you don't have to hide in the kitchen. You earned your place here this morning." Then he was gone, and Hazel was alone with the morning light streaming through the windows and the lingering smell of bacon and coffee. She touched the counter, the stove, the shelves. This kingdom she'd conquered with nothing but heat and fat, and the knowledge of what hungry men needed. For the first time in years, she felt something dangerous bloom in her chest. It felt almost like pride. The days that followed fell into a rhythm that Hazel's body learned like a language. Wake before dawn in her small cabin with the green door, where the bed was narrow but the quilts were thick and the stove kept the worst of the cold at bay. Walk across the frozen yard to the kitchen while stars still burned overhead. Build up the fire, start the coffee. Begin the endless, satisfying work of feeding 21 men who labored from sunup to sundown. Breakfast was always substantial: biscuits and gravy, fried eggs, bacon or sausage, oatmeal studded with dried fruit when she could get it, pancakes when time allowed. The men came in hungry and left satisfied, and the mockery she'd braced for never materialized. Instead, something stranger happened. They started to notice her. Not in the way men usually noticed women, or failed to notice her specifically. This was different. Dutch took to arriving 5 minutes early to help her carry the heavy platters to the table. Quinn started bringing her firewood without being asked, stacking it neatly by the kitchen door. A quiet man named Samuel, who rarely spoke to anyone, left her a basket of eggs from his own chickens, with a note that said simply, "Thank you for remembering we're human." Lunch was her daily challenge. Food that could be wrapped and carried into the fields where men were mending fences or moving cattle or doing any of the 1,000 tasks that kept a ranch alive. She made sandwiches thick with roast beef and sharp cheese. She made hand pies filled with potato and bacon. She made biscuits stuffed with ham and a smear of mustard she'd mixed herself. Whatever she sent out came back empty, and the men came back quieter, less rough around the edges. But dinner was where Hazel let herself create. She made stews that simmered all day, beef falling apart tender in broth rich with vegetables and herbs. She made roast chicken with skin so crispy it shattered at the touch, served with potatoes that had been cooked in the drippings until they were gold and soft as butter inside. She made pork chops in cream sauce. She made beef short ribs that required a knife, but barely. She made bread that came out of the oven in the late afternoon, so the kitchen filled with yeast and warmth and promise. And every single night, after the men had eaten and filed out with their thanks, less awkward now, more genuine, Rowan Cade stayed behind to wash dishes. He never asked. He simply rolled up his sleeves and worked beside her in a silence that somehow felt like conversation. Sometimes he'd comment on the meal. The chicken was good. Sometimes he'd mention ranch business. We lost 2 calves to wolves last night. Circle of life, but it's hard. Sometimes he said nothing at all, and they just worked side by side while the kitchen grew dark around them, and the only sound was water and the clink of plates. Hazel began to look forward to those moments more than she wanted to admit. There was something about the quiet competence of him, the way he treated dishwashing with the same seriousness he applied to everything else. And there was something about being treated like an equal, like someone whose work mattered enough to be shared. 3 weeks into her employment, on a night when the wind howled outside like a living thing, Rowan finished drying the last pot and said, You should know the men are calling you something. Hazel's hand stilled in the dishwater. Here it was, the nickname, the joke, the thing that would remind her she was still, fundamentally, the fat girl by the river. What? The keeper. He set the pot on its shelf with care. As in, the keeper feeds us like kings, or don't anger the keeper or we'll be back to beans. His mouth quirked slightly. Dutch started it. Says you keep them alive in more ways than one. The keeper. Not the fat cook, not the ugly one, not any of the names she'd steeled herself against. That's not cruel? Rowan looked at her, really looked at her, and his expression was harder to read than usual. Miss Boone, those men out there have worked under 5 different cooks in the 3 years I've been running this place. 3 quit, 2 I fired. Not one of them gave a damn whether the food was good or if the men felt human after eating it. You do. They know it. They respect it. He paused. And anyone who doesn't respect it will be looking for work elsewhere by morning. I meant what I said about that. Something warm and dangerous unfolded in Hazel's chest. Why does it matter to you? If they're fed, they can work. That's all you need. No, he said quietly. It's not. He was silent for a long moment, his eyes on the dark window. I spent 3 years during the war eating whatever wouldn't kill me immediately. Hardtack that broke teeth. Salt pork that was more maggot than meat. Coffee that was mostly ground acorns. I watched good men turn mean because they forgot what it felt like to taste something kind. He looked back at her. A man who's fed well works better, yes. But more than that, he remembers he's worth keeping alive. That's what you do. You remind them they matter. Hazel's throat tightened. No one had ever said anything like that to her. No one had ever suggested that her cooking was about more than just putting food on plates. I just make what I know how to make. Then you know more than you think you do. He handed her the towel to dry her hands. Get some rest, Miss Boone. Tomorrow's Sunday. The men get a late breakfast, and you get the afternoon off. He left through the door to the main house, and Hazel stood in the quiet kitchen, holding the towel he'd handed her, feeling the lingering warmth of words she'd never expected to hear. Sunday breakfast was chaos in the best way. With no work demanding their immediate attention, the men lingered over their coffee and talked. They argued about horses and cattle and cards. They told stories that were probably lies but entertaining anyway. They laughed. Not at her, but around her, like she was part of the landscape now, accepted and expected. Hazel made hotcakes piled high with butter and syrup. She made bacon until her arm ached from turning strips. She made eggs scrambled and fried and poached to order, because on Sundays men deserved to be particular. She even made cinnamon rolls, a recipe she'd been perfecting in her mind for weeks, waiting for the right moment to try. When she set the pan of rolls on the table, still hot from the oven and dripping with glaze, a man named Porter actually gasped. Are those cinnamon rolls? Dutch confirmed, already reaching for one. Lord have mercy, woman. Are you trying to make us all fall in love with you? The table erupted in laughter, and Hazel felt her face burn. But it was different from the burning shame she'd known in town. This was embarrassment, yes, but the kind that came from being included in the joke rather than being the joke itself. Can't help it if I'm irresistible, she said, surprising herself with the words. More laughter followed, and Quinn raised his coffee cup in a mock toast. To the keeper! May she never leave us! To the keeper! 20 voices echoed, and Hazel had to turn away because her eyes were burning with something that wasn't entirely pain. That afternoon, as promised, she had time to herself. She walked the ranch property, bundled in her heaviest coat, just to see the place that had become her home. The land stretched endlessly in every direction, white and pure and brutal. The cattle huddled in groups, their breath steaming. The horses in the corral watched her pass with dark, intelligent eyes. She found herself at the far edge of the property where a stand of cottonwoods grew thick enough to make a windbreak. Someone had built a bench there, crude but solid, facing the mountains. Hazel sat, letting the cold seep through her coat, watching the way the light changed the landscape from white to gold to blue. Mind company? She turned to find Rowan approaching, his coat collar turned up against the wind. She shook her head, and he sat beside her, Not too close, but close enough that she could feel the warmth of him. They sat in silence for a while, watching the mountains. Finally, Hazel said, "Why did you really hire me?" "I told you I needed a cook. You could have hired someone from town, someone prettier, someone the men would have accepted faster." Rowan was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then he said, "5 years ago I was married. Her name was Caroline. She was beautiful, the kind of beautiful that makes men stupid. I was stupid. I thought beauty meant substance." He laughed, but there was no humor in it. "She lasted 6 months out here before she decided ranch life wasn't elegant enough for her tastes, left me for a banker in Cheyenne, took half my savings and all of my pride." Hazel didn't know what to say to that, so she stayed quiet. "After she left, I hired a cook who was young and pretty because I thought that's what men needed to keep them happy. She couldn't boil water without burning it. Next, I hired someone who claimed he'd worked in restaurants back east. He lasted 2 weeks before he admitted he couldn't handle the isolation." Rowan shook his head. "I finally understood I'd been looking at it wrong. I didn't need someone decorative or someone with a fancy resume. I needed someone who understood what it meant to survive." He looked at her then, his pale eyes serious. "I asked around about you, Miss Boone. People in town told me about the fat girl by the river who kept herself and her dying father alive for 3 years on almost nothing. Who never complained, never begged, never gave up. They said it like it was gossip, like they were sharing something shameful. But what I heard was strength. What I heard was someone who'd learned to make something out of nothing and call it enough." He paused. "That's what this ranch needs. That's what those men need. Someone who knows that survival isn't pretty, but it's honest." Hazel's chest felt too full, too tight. "You barely know me." "I know enough." He stood up, brushing snow from his coat. "I know you show up before dawn and don't stop until the work is done. I know you've never complained once, even though I'm sure those men were hell the first few days. I know my dishwater's always warm because you heat it fresh for me every night, even though you could just leave it cold." He met her eyes. "I know you're the best decision I've made for this ranch in 5 years. And Miss Boone, I don't make good decisions often, so when I do, I hold on to them." He walked away before she could respond, leaving her on the bench with the cold and the mountains and a feeling she couldn't name spreading through her chest like sunrise. Winter deepened. The work continued. Hazel learned the rhythms of ranch life, how cattle needed to be fed when the snow buried the grass, how men grew quieter when the cold bit deep, how every meal became more important when the world outside was trying to kill you. She learned the men, too. Dutch had fought in the war and still had nightmares that made him wake shouting. Quinn was sending money home to his mother and 3 younger sisters. Samuel had been married once, but his wife died in childbirth, and he'd never spoken of love again. Porter dreamed of owning his own ranch someday. Thompson had a daughter he never saw, living with his ex-wife in Chicago. They were rough men, hard men, but they carried sorrows that made them human. And Hazel fed them. She fed them until they smiled easier. She fed them until they told her jokes and asked her advice and started treating the kitchen like it was holy ground, wiping their boots before entering. She fed them until they forgot to see her as the fat girl and started seeing her as the keeper, the woman who stood between them and despair. One evening, 6 weeks after she'd arrived, she was preparing dinner, a beef stew that had been cooking since morning, rich and dark and promising, when Dutch appeared in the kitchen doorway. He shifted awkwardly, hat in his hands. "Miss Boone, got a minute?" She looked up from the bread she was slicing. "Of course. What's wrong?" "Nothing's wrong, exactly." He cleared his throat. "It's just, well, it's Thompson's birthday next week. He doesn't know we know, but Quinn found out somehow. We were thinking, could you maybe make him a cake? Nothing fancy, just something to show we remembered." Hazel felt her throat tighten. These hard men, these rough souls, wanted to celebrate one of their own. "What kind of cake does he like?" "Chocolate, if it's not too much trouble." "It's not too much trouble," she said softly. "I'll make him a chocolate cake, with frosting, the kind that makes you remember birthdays should matter." Dutch's weather-beaten face broke into a smile. "You're good people, Miss Boone. Real good people." Thompson's birthday fell on a Tuesday. Hazel spent the afternoon baking, using the last of her cocoa powder and not caring that she'd need to reorder. The cake came out of the oven perfect, dark and moist and smelling like childhood memories. She made frosting with butter and sugar and more cocoa, spreading it thick and generous. That night, when the men finished dinner, Dutch stood up and cleared his throat. "Before everyone leaves, we got something to say. Thompson, you old bastard, we know it's your birthday." Thompson looked up, startled. "How?" "Doesn't matter how. What matters is you've been working this ranch for 7 years and you've earned being celebrated." Dutch nodded at Hazel. She brought out the cake, 3 layers tall and gleaming with frosting, candles burning on top. 20 men who dealt in cattle and cold and brutality started singing "Happy Birthday" in voices rough and off-key, but sincere. Thompson stared at the cake like he'd never seen such a thing, and when he tried to thank Hazel, his voice cracked and failed. "It's just cake," she said gently. "No, ma'am," he whispered. "It's proof somebody gave a damn." They cut the cake and passed around pieces, and grown men ate chocolate frosting with something like reverence. Hazel watched them, these hard souls softened by sugar and gesture, and understood what Rowan had meant. This was what food could do. This was what it meant to feed someone, not just their bodies, but the parts of them that remembered how to hope. That night, Rowan stayed even later than usual with the dishes. They worked in their customary silence until he said, "The cake was good." "Thank you. You didn't have to do that." "I know." He was quiet for another moment. "You're teaching them something important. You're teaching them that kindness isn't weakness." Hazel laughed, but it came out bitter. "I'm not kind, Mr. Cade. I'm just feeding them." "That's the same thing." He turned to look at her, and in the lamplight his eyes were darker than usual, harder to read. "My mother used to say that every meal a woman makes is an act of hope. Hope that the people she feeds will come back tomorrow. Hope that the world is worth sustaining. Hope that love can exist in small gestures." He paused. "You cook like you believe in hope, Miss Boone. That's a rare thing." Her hand stilled in the dishwater. "Your mother sounds wise." "She was. She died when I was 15. His voice was carefully neutral. "Pneumonia. Quick and cruel. My father never recovered. He died 2 years later, but really he died the day she did. Just took his body a while to catch up. I'm sorry." "Don't be. It taught me something valuable." He dried his hands, preparing to leave like he always did. But this time he paused at the door and looked back. "It taught me that the people who feed us are the people who keep us alive. Not just our bodies, our souls. And Miss Boone, you've been keeping 21 souls alive since you got here. Don't ever think that's not enough." Then he was gone, and Hazel stood in the kitchen that smelled of chocolate and hope, her hands still warm from dishwater, her heart fuller than she'd thought possible. Outside, winter held the world in its teeth, but inside, something warmer than any fire was beginning to grow. The warmth didn't last. 3 days after Thompson's birthday, the blizzard hit with a violence that made previous storms look like practice. It came without warning in the middle of the night, wind screaming like something dying, snow falling so thick it erased the world. Hazel woke in her cabin to the sound of her windows rattling in their frames and the stove struggling against cold that pressed through every crack like water finding its level. She dressed in layers and fought her way to the kitchen through wind that tried to knock her sideways. The distance that usually took 2 minutes took 15, and by the time she reached the door, her face was numb and her lungs burned from breathing ice. Inside, she built up the fire until the stove roared defiance at the storm and started coffee that would need to be strong enough to anchor men to consciousness. The hands stumbled in for breakfast looking like ghosts, snow caked in their beards and eyebrows, exhaustion carved into faces still creased from sleep. They ate quickly, mechanically, fueling up for a day of battling weather that didn't care if they lived or died. Dutch caught her eye before leaving and said, "We'll be pulling cattle out of drifts all day. Likely won't make it back for lunch. If we're not back by dark, don't worry. We'll hole up in the far barn." "Be careful," Hazel said, and meant it with an intensity that surprised her. "Always are," he lied, and followed the others into white chaos. Rowan was the last to leave. He stood at the kitchen door, adjusting his coat, his face already set in the hard expression he wore when preparing for battle. "Keep the fire high. If it gets bad, stay inside. Don't try to come out for anything. I'll be fine. Miss Boone? He looked at her directly. I mean it. This storm could last days. If something happens, nothing will happen. Go take care of your cattle. He studied her for another moment, then nodded and disappeared into the blizzard. The door slammed shut behind him, and Hazel was alone with the winds howling and the feeling that something was about to go very wrong. She spent the morning preparing food that might not be eaten, stew that could simmer for hours, biscuits wrapped and kept warm, coffee that stayed hot on the back of the stove. The world outside the windows was nothing but white fury. She couldn't see the barn, couldn't see her own cabin, couldn't see anything but snow and more snow falling like it had forgotten how to stop. Around noon, she heard it. At first she thought it was just the wind taking on a new voice, but then it came again, a sound that cut through the storm's roar because it was distinctly, terribly human. A cry, high and thin and desperate. Hazel moved to the window, pressing her face against the cold glass. Nothing, just white. But the sound came again, and this time she was sure. Someone was out there, someone small from the sound of it. A child. Her heart kicked hard against her ribs. She grabbed her heaviest coat and wrapped a scarf around her face until only her eyes showed. Rowan had said to stay inside, had made her promise. But that sound, that desperate, fading cry, made promises irrelevant. She pushed open the door and the storm hit her like a physical blow. The wind stole her breath, the snow blinded her, cold bit through her layers like they were paper. But she pushed forward, following that sound, terrified it would stop before she found its source. "Where are you?" she shouted, but the wind took her words. "Call out! I'm coming!" The cry came again, weaker now, off to her left. Hazel turned and nearly fell into a snowdrift that came up to her waist. She fought through it, her legs burning, her lungs screaming, following a sound that could have been death trying to lure her into the white. Then she saw him. A child, maybe 8 years old, dark-skinned and dark-haired, wearing clothes too thin for this weather. He was huddled against the side of the barn, nearly buried in snow, his lips blue and his eyes half closed. When he saw her, he tried to speak, but only a whimper came out. "I've got you," Hazel said, though she wasn't sure he could hear her. She pulled him up. He weighed almost nothing, this child made of ice and fear, and held him against her chest. Her body wasn't small, wasn't delicate, but right now it was warm, and that was all that mattered. She wrapped her coat around both of them as best she could and turned back toward the kitchen, praying she was going the right way because the world had become nothing but white and wind and the desperate need to survive. She found the door more by luck than navigation, got them both inside and kicked it shut behind them. The warmth of the kitchen hit like a blessing. Hazel carried the boy to the stove, wrapped him in every blanket she could find, and started stripping off his wet clothes with shaking hands. His skin was gray, his breathing shallow. Frostbite darkened his fingertips and toes. "Stay with me," she whispered, rubbing his hands between hers, trying to bring circulation back without causing more damage. "You hear me? You stay right here with me." She heated water, not too hot, that would be dangerous, and soaked cloths to wrap around his extremities. She made broth and held it to his lips, coaxing him to sip. She talked to him constantly. A stream of words meant less to communicate than to tether him to the world of the living. And slowly, terribly slowly, color began to return to his face. His eyes focused. His breathing deepened. "What's your name?" Hazel asked when he seemed capable of answering. "Makwa," he whispered. His voice was rough, accented in a way she recognized, Lakota, though her knowledge of the language was limited to the few words her father had taught her. "Means bear." "Well, Bear, you picked a hell of a day to be outside. Where's your family?" His eyes filled with tears. "Gone. Soldiers came. I ran. Got lost." Hazel's chest tightened. She'd heard the stories, the government pushing tribes onto smaller and smaller reservations, soldiers who didn't distinguish between warriors and children, families scattered like seeds on the wind. This boy had survived something she couldn't imagine, only to nearly die in a blizzard 3 miles from help. "You're safe now," she said, and meant it with every fiber of her being. "You hear me? You're safe." She was building up the fire, keeping Makwa wrapped in blankets, when the door crashed open. Rowan stood there, covered in snow, his eyes wild with something between fury and fear. "What the hell were you thinking?" His voice was rough as gravel. "I told you to stay inside. Do you have any idea?" He stopped, seeing the boy by the fire. "Who is that?" "His name is Makwa. He was outside. I heard him crying." Rowan closed his eyes briefly, and when he opened them again the fury was gone, replaced by something harder to read. He moved to the boy, kneeling down to check him over with hands that were surprisingly gentle. Frostbite. On his fingers and toes. Not severe, I think. He was conscious when I found him. You went into a blizzard for a sound you couldn't even be sure was real. It wasn't a question. What else was I supposed to do? Rowan looked at her then, really looked at her, and something in his expression made her breath catch. You could have died out there. You understand that? The men have been lost in storms like this and not found until spring. But I didn't die, and neither did he. But Miss Boone, he's a child, Hazel said, and her voice cracked. A child alone in a storm. If I'd stayed inside where it was safe, I'd have heard him dying and done nothing. Is that who you think I am? Rowan was silent for a long moment. Then he stood up, moved to where she stood by the counter, and did something that shocked her more than the storm had. He pulled the blanket from his shoulders, the heavy wool one he wore over his coat, and draped it over her. His hands lingered on her shoulders for just a moment, heavy and warm. "No," he said quietly. "It's not who you are. It's who I hoped you were." He stepped back, his face carefully neutral again. "I'll get some dry clothes for the boy. And Miss Boone? You did right, even if it scared the hell out of me." He left through the door to the main house before she could respond. Hazel stood there with his blanket around her shoulders, still smelling of horse and leather, and something distinctly him, and tried to understand what had just happened. The storm lasted 2 more days. Makwa stayed by the kitchen fire, recovering slowly, eating soup and bread, and accepting comfort with the wariness of something that had been hunted. The ranch hands, when they finally made it back from the far barn, took to him immediately. Dutch carved him a small wooden horse. Quinn taught him card games. Samuel, who rarely spoke, sat with him in the evenings and told him stories in a mixture of English and broken Lakota that made the boy smile for the first time since Hazel had found him. And Rowan made it clear without saying a word that anyone who had a problem with a Lakota boy staying at his ranch could leave immediately. No one did. The men who'd been transformed by good food were also being transformed by proximity to someone more vulnerable than themselves. They became gentler, quieter, more careful with their words and gestures. On the 3rd day after the storm, when the sky finally cleared and the world emerged white and sharp and brutal in its beauty, a man rode up to the ranch. He was older, wrapped in blankets, his face weathered beyond age. He spoke to Rowan in the yard, and though Hazel couldn't hear the conversation, she saw the moment understanding passed between them. Rowan brought him inside. "Miss Boone, this is Joseph Standing Bear. He's Makwa's grandfather." The old man's eyes found the boy immediately. Relief and grief warred on his face. "We thought you were dead." Makwa ran to him, and they held each other with the desperation of people who'd lost too much already. Hazel turned away, giving them privacy, her throat too tight to speak. Joseph Standing Bear insisted on thanking her before leaving. He took both her hands in his, weathered and strong and warm, and said something in Lakota. Then in English, "You gave me back my grandson. You gave him back his life. We won't forget." Anyone would have done the same. "No," he said firmly. "They wouldn't. But you did." He pressed something into her hand, a small carved bear, smooth from handling. "For courage. For remembering that all children are our children." They left as the sun was setting, 2 figures on 1 horse, heading north toward reservation land and a life Hazel couldn't imagine. She stood in the yard long after they'd disappeared, holding the carved bear, feeling the weight of something she couldn't name. "You gave them back to each other." She turned. Rowan stood a few feet away, watching her with an expression she'd never seen before. Soft, almost vulnerable. "I just found him in the snow. You risked your life for a stranger's child, for a Lakota boy that half this territory would have left to freeze. He moved closer. Do you have any idea how rare that is? How extraordinary? I'm not extraordinary, Hazel said, and hated how her voice shook. I'm just someone who couldn't stand the thought of a child dying when I could prevent it. That's what makes you extraordinary. He was close now, close enough that she could see the faint scar on his temple, the lines around his eyes from squinting into sun and wind. Most people can stand things, Miss Boone. Most people are very good at standing things, at finding reasons why it's not their problem, not their responsibility. You can't. You hear someone hurting and you run toward it, consequences be damned. You sound like you think that's a good thing. I think it's a terrifying thing. His voice was rough. I think it's the kind of thing that gets people hurt, but I also think it's the best thing I've ever seen. They stood in the cold, close enough to touch, but not touching, while the sky turned from gold to purple to black. Finally, Rowan said, "Come inside before you freeze," and walked back toward the house. Hazel followed, her heart doing strange things in her chest, the carved bear warm in her pocket. Spring arrived hesitantly, like something unsure of its welcome. The snow began to melt, revealing the brown grass beneath. The wind lost some of its teeth. The days stretched longer, and birds returned with songs that sounded like promises being kept. The ranch came back to life. Calves were born, wobbly and determined. Fences damaged by winter were mended. The men shed their heavy coats and worked in shirt sleeves, their faces turning brown under the returning sun. And Hazel's kitchen became even more essential. Feeding men who worked 12, 14, 16-hour days during calving season required planning and stamina that made winter look easy. She barely saw Rowan during those weeks. He was always in the fields, always dealing with some crisis or another. But every night, no matter how late, he came to the kitchen to wash dishes beside her. They were both exhausted, too tired for conversation, but the silence had become comfortable. Necessary, even. The quiet work side by side was the only peace either of them got in 18-hour days. Then Caroline arrived. It was a Tuesday in April, unseasonably warm. Hazel was making bread, her hands deep in dough, when she heard the carriage. Visitors were rare enough that she moved to the window, curious. The carriage was expensive, black lacquer and brass fittings, pulled by matched grays. The woman who stepped out was stunning in a way that made Hazel's breath catch. She was tall and slim, dressed in a traveling suit of deep blue that probably cost more than Hazel made in 3 months. Her hair was the color of honey, styled in elaborate curls beneath a hat with feathers. Her skin was porcelain perfect. Her face was the kind artists painted and poets ruined themselves over. Hazel knew who she was before anyone said a word. This was Caroline, the beautiful wife who'd left, the woman Rowan had been stupid enough to marry and smart enough to let go. She watched through the window as Rowan came out of the barn, saw Caroline, and went very still. They spoke. She couldn't hear the words, and Caroline touched his arm with a familiarity that suggested ownership. Then Caroline looked toward the house, said something, and laughed. The sound was like bells, clear and pretty and cold. The kitchen door opened. Quinn stuck his head in, his young face troubled. "Miss Boone? Mr. Cade wants you to meet a visitor." Hazel's stomach dropped. She looked down at herself, flour on her dress, dough under her fingernails, her hair escaping its pins. She looked like exactly what she was. The help. The fat girl hired to cook. "Give me a moment." She washed her hands and tried to tame her hair, but there was only so much that could be done. Finally, she squared her shoulders and walked out to where Rowan and Caroline stood in the yard. Up close, Caroline was even more beautiful. Her eyes were green, bright, and assessing. She looked Hazel up and down with the kind of thoroughness usually reserved for livestock at auction, and her perfect mouth curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. "So this is who you settled for?" Caroline's voice was light, amused. "A pig in an apron? My God, Rowan, I knew you'd gotten desperate, but this is pathetic even for you." The words hit like fists. Hazel felt her face burn, felt her whole body try to fold in on itself. Every insult she'd ever endured, every whisper, every cruel laugh, they all came rushing back. She was 14 again, hearing boys mock her behind the schoolhouse. She was 20, watching her father's friends look away in embarrassment. She was every age she'd ever been, feeling the weight of being too much, of taking up too much space, of being fundamentally, irredeemably wrong. That's enough. Rowan's voice cracked like a whip. You need to leave. Oh, come now. I just got here. Caroline's laugh was crystalline. I came all this way to see if the rumors were true. They said you'd hired some fat kitchen girl to feed your men, and I had to see for myself. Though I have to say, Rowan, I expected better taste from you, even if it's just the help. Hazel couldn't breathe, couldn't move. Every eye in the yard was on her. Dutch, Quinn, Samuel, Porter, Thompson, all of them watching her humiliation. The keeper, reduced back to what she'd always been. The fat girl. The joke. The pig in an apron. She turned to run, to hide, to disappear back into the kitchen where she could pretend this hadn't happened. But before she could take a step, Rowan's voice rang out across the yard, loud enough that every man on the ranch could hear. Miss Boone. He wasn't looking at Caroline anymore. He was looking at her, his pale eyes fierce. Don't you dare move. Hazel froze. Rowan turned to Caroline and his face was harder than Hazel had ever seen it. You asked me once why I never fought for us. Why I let you leave without begging you to stay. His voice was cold, precise. I'm going to tell you now. I didn't fight because there was nothing worth fighting for. You were beautiful and empty, and I was too young and stupid to know the difference. You lasted 6 months here because you couldn't stand that ranch life required actual work, because you thought being pretty exempted you from being useful. Caroline's smile faltered. Rowan, I'm not finished. He took a step toward her, and she actually backed up. Miss Boone has been on this ranch for 4 months. In that time, she's fed 21 men 3 meals a day without a single complaint. She's worked from before dawn to after dark. She went into a blizzard to save a child she didn't know and nearly died doing it. She's taught every man here that kindness isn't weakness and that being fed well means being cared for. His voice got quieter, but somehow more intense. She stayed when you left. She's got more heart, more courage, more worth in her little finger than you've got in your entire perfect body. And if you can't see that, then you're even emptier than I remember. The yard was absolutely silent. 20 men stood frozen, watching. Caroline's face had gone white, then red. You're defending her? This fat cow? I'm choosing her. Rowan's words rang out clear. I'm choosing the woman who shows up every day and does the work. I'm choosing substance over surface. I'm choosing someone who makes life worth living instead of just worth looking at. He turned to Hazel. And Miss Boone, if you're willing, I'm choosing you to stay on this ranch for as long as you want to be here, because this place isn't home without you in it. Hazel couldn't breathe, couldn't think. The words echoed in her head. I'm choosing you, I'm choosing you, I'm choosing you. Caroline made a sound of pure disgust. You'll regret this. Both of you. When you're eating her cooking and looking at that body and remembering what you gave up. I'm remembering what I escaped, Rowan said flatly. Now get off my land. You've got 5 minutes before I have the men escort you. Caroline stared at him, fury and humiliation warring on her beautiful face. Then she turned on her heel, climbed into her carriage, and disappeared in a cloud of dust and rage. The silence that followed was deafening. Hazel stood in the yard trembling, aware of every man watching her, waiting to see what she'd do, how she'd respond to being defended so publicly, so fiercely. Dutch cleared his throat. Miss Boone? That was the bravest thing I've ever seen. You standing here taking that, not running. That's courage. Damn right, Quinn added. And boss is right. You're worth 10 of her, worth 100. One by one, the men voiced their agreement, their support, their fierce protective loyalty, and Hazel realized something that made her throat tighten and her eyes burn. These men, these rough, hard, broken men, they'd become her family. They'd become the people who saw her worth when she couldn't see it herself. Thank you, she whispered. All of you. They dispersed slowly, returning to work with backward glances and small smiles, until only Rowan remained, standing a few feet away, his expression carefully neutral. I'm sorry, he said. You shouldn't have had to hear that. You defended me. Hazel's voice shook. You chose me. In front of everyone. Why? Rowan was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, because it was true. every word. You're the best thing that's happened to this ranch, to these men. He paused. To me. Something shifted in the air between them, subtle but unmistakable. Hazel felt it like a change in temperature, like the moment before lightning strikes. Mr. Cade, Rowan, he said. After what just happened, I think you can call me Rowan. Rowan, she tested the name. It felt strange on her tongue, intimate. I don't know what to say. You don't have to say anything. Just stay. Keep doing what you're doing. Keep being who you are. He smiled slightly. Keep reminding us that life's worth waking up for. He walked back toward the barn, leaving Hazel standing in the yard with the sun warm on her face and something terrifying and wonderful blooming in her chest. That night, Rowan came to the kitchen later than usual. The dishes were already washed, put away. Hazel was making bread for tomorrow, her hands working the dough with the steady rhythm that helped her think. He didn't say anything at first, just leaned against the counter and watched her work. Finally, "You're still here. Where else would I be?" "I thought maybe after today," he trailed off. Hazel shaped the dough into loaves and set them to rise. Then she turned to face him, wiping her hands on her apron. "Mr. Cade, Rowan, I've spent 27 years being told I'm not enough. Not pretty enough, not small enough, not worthy enough of being seen as anything but a joke or a problem." Her voice was steady despite the emotion behind it. "Today, for the first time in my life, someone stood up for me. Someone chose me. Do you understand what that means? What you gave me? I only told the truth. The truth is powerful when nobody else has bothered to speak it." She took a breath. "So yes, I'm still here. I'm staying. Because you're right. This place feels like home. And I haven't had a home since my father died." Rowan moved closer, and for a moment she thought he might touch her. Instead, he said quietly, "I need you to understand something. What I said out there about choosing you, I meant it. Not just as my cook, as—" He struggled for words. "As someone I can't imagine this place without. As someone I don't want to imagine my life without." Hazel's heart hammered. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying I'm falling for you, Hazel Boone. Have been since you made that first breakfast and proved you could turn bacon fat and cornmeal into something worth remembering." He smiled, but his eyes were serious. "I'm saying I see you. Not what you look like, but who you are. And who you are is extraordinary." She couldn't speak, could barely breathe. This man who could have anyone, who'd had someone beautiful and lost her, was standing in her kitchen saying words she'd never expected to hear in her entire life. "You don't have to say anything," Rowan continued. "I'm not asking for promises. I just needed you to know. Needed you to understand that what happened today wasn't just about defending my cook. It was about defending someone I—" He stopped, then finished quietly. "Someone I'm beginning to love." The words hung in the air between them, impossibly heavy and light at the same time. Hazel found her voice. "I don't know how to do this. To be seen like this. To be wanted." "Neither do I," he admitted. "My first attempt at love was a disaster, but maybe that's the point. Maybe we figure it out together. Maybe we build something real instead of something pretty." He left before she could respond, disappearing into the main house. Hazel stood alone in her kitchen, her hands still smelling of yeast and possibility, and let herself imagine something she'd never dared consider before. A future. A home. A love that saw her scars and chose her anyway. Outside, spring continued its careful advance, and inside, something equally fragile was beginning to bloom. The days following Rowan's confession moved like honey in winter, slow, thick with possibility, sweet and terrifying in equal measure. Hazel found herself hyper-aware of every moment they shared. The morning he brought her fresh eggs still warm from the henhouse, his fingers brushing hers as he handed over the basket. The evening he stayed an extra hour after dishes just to talk about nothing important. The weather, the new calves, a book he'd been reading. The way he'd started saying her name, Hazel instead of Miss Boone, like he was tasting something precious. She didn't know how to navigate this new territory. Romance had never been part of her story. She'd resigned herself to a life of usefulness rather than love. of being valued for what she could do rather than who she was. But Rowan looked at her like she was both, like her cooking and her courage were inseparable from her worth as a woman. It terrified her. One evening in late April, as they worked side by side in the kitchen, Rowan said casually, "There's a dance in Clearmont next Saturday. The spring social. Whole territory shows up." Hazel's hand stilled in the dishwater. "I know. I used to hear about it when my father was alive." "Ever been?" "No." The word came out harder than she intended. "Women like me don't get asked to dances." Rowan was quiet for a moment. Then he set down the plate he'd been drying and turned to face her fully. "I'm asking." Her heart lurched. "Rowan, I want to take you, want to dance with you, want every person in that territory to see me with the woman who makes my life worth living." His voice was steady, certain. "But only if you want to go. Only if you're ready for people to see us together." Hazel turned away, gripping the edge of the sink. "You don't understand what you're asking. Those people, they've known me my whole life as the fat girl by the river. They'll laugh. They'll whisper. They'll say terrible things about both of us. Let them. It's easy for you to say, you're—" She gestured helplessly. "You're successful, respected. You can survive their gossip. But me? I've spent my whole life trying to avoid their cruelty, and now you want me to walk right into it?" Rowan moved closer, and she felt the warmth of him at her back. "Hazel, look at me." She turned slowly. His pale eyes were intense, serious. "I know what I'm asking," he said quietly. "I know it's not fair. I know you've survived by being invisible, and I'm asking you to be seen. But that's what you deserve, to be seen, to be chosen publicly, not just in private moments between us." He paused. "And I think there's a part of you that wants it too, that wants to walk into that dance hall and prove to everyone who ever hurt you that you're worth more than they said." He was right, and that made it worse. There was a part of her, small, buried, but stubbornly alive, that wanted exactly that. Wanted to show Mrs. Granger from the general store and the girls who'd giggled behind their hands and every person who'd ever made her feel less than human that she'd found someone who saw her worth. "What if I can't dance?" she asked, hating how small her voice sounded. "Then we'll stand in the corner and eat terrible punch and make fun of everyone else's dancing." He smiled slightly. "Or I'll teach you. Right now, if you want." Before she could respond, he took her hand, her rough, scarred, flour-dusted hand, and placed his other hand at her waist. The kitchen was empty except for them, lit only by lamplight, smelling of soap and the lingering traces of dinner. It was about as far from a ballroom as possible. "There's no music," Hazel protested weakly. "Doesn't matter." He started moving, slow and simple, just a basic box step. "Dancing is just moving with intention, and you're good at intention." She stumbled at first, hyper-aware of her body, of how much of her there was, of how his hand at her waist must be able to feel every soft, generous curve. But Rowan didn't falter, didn't pull away, just kept moving with a patience that made her throat tight. "I'm too heavy for this," she said. "I'll step on your feet." "You're not too anything." His voice was firm. "And I've been stepped on by horses. I think I can handle it." Despite herself, she laughed, and as she did, something loosened in her chest. Her feet found the rhythm. Her body remembered that it could move with something other than shame. By the time they'd circled the kitchen twice, she was almost enjoying it. This strange private dance in a place that smelled more of onions than roses. When they finally stopped, Rowan kept his hand at her waist. "So, will you come with me?" Hazel looked up at him, at this man who'd given her work, purpose, safety, and now wanted to give her something even more dangerous, visibility. "Yes," she heard herself say. "I'll go." His smile was like sunrise. "Good, because I was going to keep asking until you said yes." The week leading up to the dance, Hazel was a wreck of nerves and second-guessing. She had nothing appropriate to wear. Her 3 dresses were all practical work things, stained and mended and thoroughly unsuited for a social event. She mentioned this to no one, resigned to wearing her least damaged dress and enduring the inevitable comparisons to the other women. Then Quinn appeared at her kitchen door with a package wrapped in brown paper. "This came for you, Miss Boone, from town." Hazel took it, confused. "I didn't order anything." "Someone did." Quinn grinned and disappeared before she could question him further. Inside the package was a dress. Not fancy, not elaborate, but new and whole and beautiful in its simplicity. Dark green fabric, good wool, not cheap cotton, a modest neckline, long sleeves. A cut that would accommodate her body without trying to apologize for it. And pinned to the collar, a note in Rowan's precise handwriting. The color of creek water after rain. Thought you should have something that sees you the way I do. Hazel sat down hard on a kitchen stool, the dress pooling in her lap, and cried. Not sad tears, but the kind that come when someone sees a need you didn't voice and meets it anyway. When someone gives you not just what you asked for, but what you needed without knowing to ask. Saturday arrived with unseasonable warmth, the kind of spring day that felt like a promise being kept. Hazel spent the morning cooking. The men still needed to be fed, dance or no dance. But Dutch waved her off after lunch. We can handle dinner tonight. You go make yourself pretty. Not that you need to, he added quickly. You're already, well, you know what I mean. She did, and for once she let herself believe it might be true. In her small cabin, Hazel bathed in water she'd heated on the stove, using soap that smelled of lavender. Another gift, this one from Samuel, who'd said gruffly that his late wife used to make it, and he still had some left. She washed her hair and let it dry in the sun streaming through her window. Then she put on the green dress, and it fit like it had been made for her body specifically, not trying to minimize or hide, just acknowledging her shape and working with it rather than against it. She'd never owned anything so beautiful. There was a mirror in her cabin, small and speckled with age. Hazel looked at herself and for the first time in her life didn't immediately catalog everything wrong. She just looked, saw a woman in a green dress with clean hair and capable hands and eyes that held more hope than fear. You can do this, she told her reflection. You've survived worse than a dance. The knock came at sunset. Rowan stood on her small porch, dressed in clothes she'd never seen him wear. A proper suit, dark and well cut, that made him look less like a rancher and more like someone who'd walked out of a photograph. His hair was combed back, his jaw was freshly shaved, but his eyes were the same, that pale, intense blue that saw through everything false. He looked at her for a long moment without speaking. Then he said, voice rough, "You're beautiful. The dress is beautiful. You chose well. Hazel." He waited until she met his eyes. "I chose the dress because I thought the color would suit you, but what's beautiful is you wearing it, you understanding that you deserve beautiful things." She didn't trust herself to speak, so she just nodded. He offered his arm, and she took it, feeling the solid strength of him beneath the fabric of his suit. The ride to Clearmont took 30 minutes. Rowan had hitched up a buggy rather than making them ride horseback, and they traveled through landscape that was finally shaking off winter's grip. Green pushed through brown. Wildflowers dotted the hills. Birds sang their territorial claims. The world was remembering how to live, and Hazel felt like she was remembering too. "You're quiet," Rowan observed. "Nervous." "Me too." She glanced at him, surprised. "You? Why would you be nervous?" "Because I'm about to take the most important person in my life into a room full of people who might hurt her," he said bluntly. "And if anyone says something cruel, I'm going to have to choose between defending your honor and not getting arrested for assault." Despite everything, Hazel laughed. "Please don't get arrested. I need you to run the ranch." "I'll try to restrain myself, but I'm making no promises." They arrived just as full dark was falling. The community hall was lit up like a beacon, music already spilling out into the spring night. Buggies and horses crowded the space outside. People moved in clusters, dressed in their finest, laughing and talking with the relief of those who'd survived another winter. Rowan helped Hazel down from the buggy, his hand steady at her elbow. "Ready?" "No, but let's go anyway." They walked toward the hall together, and Hazel felt every eye turn toward them. Felt the moment of recognition. That's Rowan Cade, successful rancher, and that's... Wait, is that the Boone girl? The fat one? What is she doing with him? Felt the whispers start like wind through grass. Rowan's hand tightened slightly on her arm. Not possessive, just present, reminding her he was there. They stepped through the door into warmth and noise and light. The hall was decorated with spring flowers and ribbon. A band played on a small stage, fiddle, guitar, someone on a makeshift drum. The dance floor was already crowded with couples, and tables around the perimeter held punch bowls and plates of food that looked sad compared to what Hazel made daily. The whispers got louder. People stopped mid-conversation to stare. Mrs. Granger from the general store actually put her hand to her chest in shock. A group of young women near the punch table erupted in barely suppressed giggles. Hazel felt her face burn, felt her body try to fold in on itself. This was a mistake. She should have known. She should have... "Dance with me," Rowan said, his voice cutting through her panic. "Right now, before you talk yourself into leaving." "Rowan, everyone's staring. Let them stare. Let them see that I choose you, that you're worth choosing." He led her onto the dance floor, taking her hand, placing his other hand at her waist, exactly like he had in the kitchen. "Eyes on me, Hazel. Not them. Me." She looked up at him, and his face was serious, focused entirely on her. The music shifted to something slower, more deliberate, and they began to dance. Hazel stumbled once, twice, hyper-aware of how many people were watching. But Rowan's hands were steady, his movement confident, and gradually her body remembered the steps they'd practiced. Gradually, the rest of the room faded until it was just the two of them, moving together in a space they'd carved out of judgment and fear. "You're doing fine," Rowan murmured. "Better than fine. I can feel them staring. Then they're seeing what I see. Someone brave enough to walk into a room that's hurt her before. Someone strong enough to dance anyway." They made it through one full dance, then another. Other couples joined them on the floor, and the intense focus on Hazel diffused slightly. She began to breathe easier, began to feel her shoulders drop from around her ears. Then she heard it. A voice, female and deliberately loud enough to carry. "Well, I suppose if you can't find a real woman, you settle for whatever's available, even if you need a wagon to transport her." Laughter followed. Cruel, sharp laughter that Hazel knew too well. She stopped dancing, looked toward the voice. It was Millicent Patterson, daughter of the bank owner, 22, and pretty in the way that required no effort or character. She stood with two friends, all of them looking at Hazel with expressions of amused contempt. "Ignore them," Rowan said, his voice tight with controlled anger. But Hazel couldn't. Something in her, something that had been beaten down and buried for 27 years, suddenly rose up with a fury that surprised her. She pulled away from Rowan and walked straight toward Millicent Patterson. The younger woman's smile faltered as Hazel approached. "Did you want something?" "I want you to understand something," Hazel said, her voice carrying in the sudden quiet. "You're young and pretty, and you think that makes you valuable. And maybe it does, for now. But pretty fades, Miss Patterson. Pretty gets old, gets sick, gets forgotten. You know what doesn't fade? Being useful, being kind, being someone people need instead of just want to look at." Millicent's face reddened. "How dare you? I dare because I've spent my whole life listening to people like you tell me I'm worthless because I'm not pretty. And I'm done." Hazel's voice was steady, strong. "I feed 21 men 3 meals a day. I've saved a child's life. I've built something that matters. What have you done besides look good at dances?" The hall had gone completely silent. Everyone was watching now, but it felt different than before. Not mocking, expectant, waiting to see what would happen next. Millicent opened her mouth, closed it, then said with vicious precision, "At least men want to look at me. At least I'm not so desperate for attention that I have to buy it with food." Before Hazel could respond, before Rowan could step in, a new voice cut through the tension. "That's enough, Millicent." Everyone turned. Mrs. Elizabeth Morrison stood near the punch table, elderly and respected and known for speaking her mind. She walked slowly toward them, her cane tapping against the floor. "You want to talk about value?" Mrs. Morrison said, looking at Millicent. "My grandson works at Cade Ranch. He writes to me every week. You know what he says? He says Miss Boone taught them that being fed well means being cared for, that she makes food that reminds them they're human, not just labor, that she saved a Lakota child during the blizzard when most folks would have stayed inside." She turned to Hazel. "That sounds pretty valuable to me." "She's just a cook," Millicent protested weakly. "She's someone who matters," Mrs. Morrison said firmly, "which is more than I can say for a girl whose only skill is looking good while saying cruel things." She looked around the hall. Anyone else want to join in mocking Miss Boone? Because you'll have to go through me first, and I'm old and mean and don't care about making enemies." The silence stretched. Then, incredibly, someone started clapping. Dutch, who'd apparently come to the dance with several of the other ranch hands, stood near the door applauding slowly, deliberately. Quinn joined him. Then Samuel, then Porter and Thompson, and half a dozen others. The applause spread. Not everyone joined in. Some people looked away, embarrassed. Others still whispered, but enough people clapped that the sound filled the hall, and Millicent Patterson's face went from red to white to red again before she turned and fled, her friends scurrying after her. Mrs. Morrison touched Hazel's arm. "You hold your head up, girl. You've earned it." Then she walked away, and Hazel stood in the middle of the dance floor, shaking with adrenaline and something that might have been triumph. Rowan was beside her in an instant. That was incredible. That was terrifying. "Same thing sometimes," he smiled. "Want to get out of here? I think we've provided enough entertainment for one night." "Yes, please." They left the hall together, walking out into cool night air that felt like freedom. Behind them, the music resumed, the dance continuing without them. They climbed into the buggy, and Rowan took the reins, but he didn't immediately urge the horses forward. "Hazel," he said quietly, "what you did in there, standing up for yourself, that took more courage than anything I've ever seen. I was just tired of being quiet, tired of accepting cruelty like it was my due." "You should never accept it. You should never have had to." He turned to face her, his expression serious in the moonlight. "I meant what I said before, about falling for you. But I need you to know I'm all the way fallen now. I love you, Hazel Boone. I love your strength and your stubbornness and the way you make bacon fat taste like salvation. I love that you ran into a blizzard for a stranger's child. I love that you just faced down your demons in a dance hall full of people." He paused. "I love you, and I'm not good at saying things pretty, but I need you to know it's true." Hazel couldn't breathe, couldn't think past the roaring in her ears. "You love me." "I do." "Why?" The question came out broken. I'm not what men want. I'm not beautiful or delicate or—" "You're what I want," he interrupted. "Exactly as you are. And Hazel, I think you love me too. I think you're just terrified to admit it because you've never let yourself believe you could be loved." He was right. She knew he was right. The feeling had been growing for weeks. The way her heart lifted when she heard his voice, the way she counted the hours until he'd appear in the kitchen for dishes, the way she'd started imagining a future that included more than just survival. "I do," she whispered. "Love you. I'm terrified and I don't know how to do this, but I love you." Rowan smiled, a real smile, full and bright and beautiful. Then he leaned across the space between them and kissed her. It was gentle, questioning, giving her every opportunity to pull away. But Hazel didn't pull away. She leaned into it, into him, into the impossible reality that someone wanted her, loved her, chose her. When they finally broke apart, Rowan rested his forehead against hers. "Come home with me. Not to your cabin. To the main house. To my bed, if you want it. Or just to talk more. Or to sit in the same room and exist together. I don't care. I just want you close." What will the men think? That their boss finally got smart enough to recognize a good thing. He pulled back to look at her. "And Hazel, I don't care what anyone thinks anymore. Not the town, not gossips, not anyone. I care what you think, what you want, what makes you happy." What made her happy? When was the last time anyone had asked her that? When was the last time she'd even asked herself? "I want to be with you," she said. "I want to stop being afraid of wanting things. Then we'll figure it out together. Build something real, something that matters." They drove home under stars that seemed brighter than usual, through darkness that felt less like danger and more like possibility. And when they arrived at the ranch, Rowan helped her down from the buggy and took her hand, and they walked together toward the main house, toward a future neither of them could have imagined 6 months ago. The weeks that followed were a strange, sweet adjustment. Hazel still worked in the kitchen, still woke before dawn to feed 21 men who needed her cooking. But now Rowan would appear earlier, help her start the fires, steal kisses while coffee percolated. The men noticed, of course, But their reaction was surprising. Not judgment or mockery, but genuine happiness. Dutch pulled Rowan aside one morning and said loudly enough for everyone to hear, "About damn time you got smart, boss." But happiness, Hazel had learned, was never uncomplicated. And trouble arrived on a Thursday in late May, riding in on disaster's coattails. It started with Thompson collapsing in the yard, fever burning through him like wildfire. Then Quinn went down, then Samuel, then 3 more men in rapid succession. Within 2 days, half the ranch hands were bedridden with something that turned their skin gray and their breathing ragged. "It's the same sickness that hit the Patterson ranch," the doctor from town said, his face grim. He was old, tired, and clearly overwhelmed. "Some kind of fever, spreads fast, hits hard. You need to isolate the sick ones, keep them hydrated, try to get the fever down. Beyond that," he shrugged helplessly, "I've got 4 other ranches with the same problem. Can't stay. Do what you can." Then he left, and Hazel stared at 10 men who were depending on her for more than just food. Rowan found her standing in the doorway of the bunkhouse where they'd moved the sick men. "What do you need?" His question was simple, direct. "Herbs. Willow bark for the fever, if you can find it. Honey, more blankets. Time I don't have." She looked at him. "I can't feed everyone and nurse 10 men back to health. It's not possible." "Then I'll feed them. You focus on keeping these men alive." "You can't cook." "I can open cans and boil water. It won't be good, but it'll keep them from starving." He touched her face gently. "Save them, Hazel. I'll handle everything else." She wanted to argue, wanted to insist she could do both, but she knew her limits. "All right, but if anyone complains about the food, they can cook it themselves," he finished. "Now go. Show them what you're made of." Hazel worked for 4 days straight with almost no sleep. She boiled herbs into tea that smelled terrible but brought fevers down. She made broth and coaxed it into men too weak to feed themselves. She changed sweat-soaked sheets and bathed burning foreheads and talked constantly, to keep the sick men tethered to consciousness, to keep herself from collapsing, to remind them all that survival was possible if they just held on. On the 3rd night, Dutch's fever broke. On the 4th morning, Quinn opened his eyes and asked for real food. By the end of the week, all 10 men were weak but recovering, and not a single one had died. Hazel walked out of the bunkhouse on the 8th day to find the sun rising over the ranch, golden and promising. Her dress was soaked with sweat. Her hands shook with exhaustion. Her eyes burned from lack of sleep. But they were alive. All of them. She'd kept them alive. Rowan was waiting in the yard. He looked almost as exhausted as she felt. He'd been running the ranch with half a crew while learning to cook meals that wouldn't poison anyone. When he saw her, relief flooded his face. "They're going to make it," she said. "All of them." He crossed the space between them in 3 strides and pulled her into his arms. "You saved them, all of them. Do you understand what you did?" "I just did what needed doing." "No." His voice was fierce. "You did something impossible. You worked yourself to collapse to keep 10 men alive. He pulled back to look at her, and his eyes were bright with something that might have been tears. "You're the strongest person I've ever met." Hazel sagged against him, too tired to stand on her own anymore. "I need to sleep for a week." "Then sleep. I'll carry you if I have to." He did, actually. Carried her to the main house, to his bed, and she was asleep before he even got her boots off. She slept for 16 hours straight, dreamless and deep, and woke to find Rowan sitting in a chair beside the bed, reading by lamplight. "You stayed," she said, her voice rough from sleep. "Where else would I be?" He set down his book. "How do you feel?" "Like I've been trampled by cattle." She sat up slowly, every muscle protesting. "The men?" "Dutch is already back on light duty. The others are improving. They want to thank you, but I told them you needed rest first." Hazel nodded, then looked around the room, Rowan's room, which she'd never been in before beyond that first night. It was sparse but comfortable. Books lined one wall. A window faced east. The bed was big enough for 2. "Hazel," Rowan said carefully, "when you're ready, we need to talk about something." Her heart sank. Here it was, the reality check. The moment when he'd realized that loving someone and living with them were different things. "All right." He moved to sit on the edge of the bed, taking her hand. "I've been thinking. About us. about what we're doing, and I think we're going about it backward. What do you mean? I mean, you're living in the cabin, working in the kitchen, and we're stealing moments between responsibilities like we're doing something wrong. He met her eyes. I don't want to steal moments anymore. I want to build a life, with you, properly. Hazel's breath caught. Rowan, marry me. The words came out rushed, nervous. I know it's fast. I know you probably need time to think about it, but I've never been more sure of anything. You're my home, Hazel. You're what makes every day worth living. And I want to wake up next to you every morning and fall asleep beside you every night and build something together that's more than just surviving. She stared at him, unable to process what he was asking. Marriage. He was asking her to marry him. The fat girl by the river. The woman who'd resigned herself to a life alone. You could do better, she whispered. You could find someone. There is no better than you, he interrupted. There's no one I want more. No one I trust more. No one I love more. His hand tightened on hers. But I need you to want it too. Need you to believe you deserve it. So I'm asking, and I'll keep asking until you're ready to say yes. But Hazel, will you marry me? She looked at this man who'd given her work, purpose, safety, love, who'd defended her in front of his ex-wife and the whole territory, who'd washed dishes beside her every night and learned to cook terrible food so she could save 10 men's lives, who saw her strength when she couldn't see it herself. Yes, she said, and her voice was steady, sure. Yes, I'll marry you. His smile could have lit the whole territory. He pulled her close and kissed her, deeper this time, more certain, promising things that made her heart race. When they finally broke apart, he was laughing. What's funny? She asked. I'm marrying the keeper. The men are going to lose their minds. They're going to worry you'll steal me away from the kitchen. Never. That kitchen's yours. This ranch is yours. Everything I have is yours. He grew serious. And Hazel, I know this is fast. I know we've got things to figure out, but we'll figure them out together. Build something that matters, something real. Something that feeds more than just bodies, she said softly, remembering his mother's words about hope. Exactly. He kissed her forehead. Now rest. You've earned it. And when you wake up, we'll tell everyone and start planning our future. Hazel lay back down, but this time Rowan lay beside her, fully clothed, just holding her. She fell asleep to the sound of his heartbeat, steady and sure, and dreamed of a future where she was chosen every single day. The news spread through the ranch like spring water finding its course. Inevitable, natural, right. Dutch heard first because he was back on his feet and happened to be in the yard when Rowan and Hazel emerged from the main house together, hands intertwined, faces showing everything they'd stopped trying to hide. The old cowboy took one look at them, broke into a grin that split his weathered face, and hollered loud enough to wake the cattle. The boss finally got smart. We're getting the keeper permanent. Men poured out of the bunkhouse, some still moving slow from illness, but all of them grinning like fools. Quinn let out a whoop that echoed off the mountains. Samuel, who never showed emotion, actually smiled. Thompson pulled out a harmonica from somewhere and started playing a tune that might have been a wedding march if he'd known how to play better. You're all idiots, Rowan said, but he was smiling too, his arm around Hazel's waist like he was afraid she might disappear if he let go. When's the wedding? Porter called out. Because we need to know how long we've got to clean ourselves up. Some of us take longer than others. He elbowed Quinn, who protested loudly. Hazel found her voice, though it shook slightly. We haven't decided yet. Soon, probably. Nothing fancy. The hell it won't be fancy, Dutch declared. You saved 10 men's lives last week. You've been feeding us like kings for 6 months. You're getting a proper wedding if we have to build a cathedral ourselves. I don't need a cathedral, Hazel protested. I just need— You need to be celebrated, Rowan interrupted quietly. You need to be honored the way you deserve. And these men want to do it, so let them. She looked around at the faces watching her, these rough, hard men who'd become family. They were looking at her with genuine affection, with protective pride, with the fierce loyalty of people who'd been cared for and wanted to care back. Her throat tightened dangerously. All right, she said softly, but nothing too elaborate. I'm not that kind of woman. You're every kind of woman worth having, Dutch said firmly. Now let's plan a wedding that proves it. The next 2 weeks were a blur of activity that both touched and overwhelmed Hazel. The men threw themselves into preparations with the same intensity they applied to ranch work. Dutch and Samuel built an arbor from fresh-cut cottonwood, decorating it with early summer wildflowers they rode miles to collect. Quinn somehow procured white ribbon from 3 different towns, claiming he wanted options. Porter practiced a speech he was apparently planning to give, though no one had asked him to. Thompson cleaned his harmonica and learned 5 new songs. The women of the territory, hearing about the wedding, had mixed reactions. Some were scandalized, Rowan Cade marrying his cook, and such an unfortunate-looking one at that. But others, the ones who'd worked hard themselves, who understood that value came from more than appearance, they sent gifts. Mrs. Morrison arrived with her grandmother's wedding veil, yellowed with age but beautiful. A rancher's wife from 20 miles away brought a cake pan and a recipe she swore would make the best wedding cake in Wyoming. Even some of the younger women, perhaps shamed by Hazel's courage at the dance, sent small tokens, handkerchiefs, ribbons, a jar of lavender water for the wedding day. Hazel worked through it all in a daze of disbelief and wonder. She still cooked, the men still needed feeding, but now Rowan insisted on helping more, claiming he needed practice for when they were properly married and sharing all tasks. His cooking had improved from barely edible to survivable, which he considered a victory. One evening, a week before the wedding, Hazel was alone in the kitchen making bread when Mrs. Morrison arrived unannounced. The elderly woman walked in without knocking, as was her way, and settled herself at the work table with a sigh of relief. "My joints aren't what they used to be," she announced. "Getting old is a terrible business. Don't recommend it." Hazel smiled despite her nerves. "Can I get you something? Coffee? Tea?" "Whiskey, but my doctor says no, so tea will do." Mrs. Morrison watched Hazel work for a moment. "You're making bread for tomorrow's breakfast already." "I like to stay ahead. Keeps me from panicking." "Smart girl." Mrs. Morrison accepted the tea Hazel poured. "Though I suspect you're panicking anyway, just quietly." Hazel's hands stilled in the dough. "Is it that obvious?" "To someone who's been watching, yes." The old woman sipped her tea. "You want to know why I'm really here?" "I assume to check on wedding preparations." "That's the excuse. The real reason is to tell you something I wish someone had told me before I got married 60 years ago." Mrs. Morrison set down her cup. "Being chosen doesn't mean you're fixed. Getting married doesn't erase all the years of hurt that came before. You're going to have days when you look at Rowan and wonder why he chose you, when you'll hear an old voice in your head saying you're not enough, when fear will try to convince you this can't be real." Hazel's throat tightened. "How did you know?" "Because I felt it too. Different reasons. I was poor, he was from a good family, but the doubt was the same." Mrs. Morrison leaned forward. "Here's what I learned. Love isn't about being perfect enough to deserve it. Love is about being brave enough to accept it anyway. About waking up every day and choosing to believe that maybe, just maybe, you're worth what someone else sees in you. What if I can't? What if I wake up one day and can't believe it anymore?" Then you tell Rowan. You let him remind you. You let these men who'd fight wolves for you remind you. You let the life you've built here remind you. Mrs. Morrison smiled. "And if that doesn't work, you come to me and I'll knock some sense into you with my cane. I'm old enough that people expect me to be mean, so I might as well use it for good." Despite everything, Hazel laughed. "Thank you." "Don't thank me yet. I'm also here to tell you the reception menu you planned is too modest. These people are coming to celebrate you, and you're feeding them like it's just another meal. We're adding roast beef and 3 kinds of pie. And that cornbread and cream sauce you made that first morning because my grandson hasn't shut up about it since January." "Mrs. Morrison, no arguments. Consider it a wedding gift, me telling you that you're allowed to be extravagant about your own celebration." The old woman stood up, joints creaking. "Now I'm going home before my daughter sends out a search party. But Hazel, one more thing." "Yes?" "What you're doing, marrying Rowan, building this life, proving that worth comes from character rather than appearance, it matters. There are girls in this territory who've grown up thinking they're not valuable because they don't look a certain way. You're showing them something different. Don't underestimate the importance of that." She left before Hazel could respond, and Hazel stood alone in her kitchen with dough under her fingernails and tears on her face, understanding for the first time that her story was bigger than just her own survival. The wedding day arrived with perfect weather, warm but not hot, with a breeze that carried the scent of wildflowers and fresh earth. Hazel woke before dawn out of habit, then remembered she wasn't supposed to cook today. The men had insisted on handling all the food, which terrified her on multiple levels, but Rowan had been firm. "One day," he'd said. "One single day where someone else takes care of you." She bathed in water that Quinn had heated and delivered to her cabin, using the lavender water the young women had sent until the small space smelled like a garden. She put on the wedding dress that Mrs. Morrison and 3 other women had helped her make. Simple white cotton, because silk was too expensive and too impractical, but fitted carefully to her body with tiny buttons down the back and lace at the collar that had been someone's grandmother's once upon a time. When she looked in her small mirror, she saw a woman she barely recognized, not because she looked different, but because she looked happy. The fear was still there, it would probably always be there, but underneath it was something stronger: hope, belief, the tentative understanding that maybe she deserved this. A knock on her cabin door made her jump. "It's me," Mrs. Morrison called, "and I've brought help." Hazel opened the door to find not just Mrs. Morrison, but 5 other women, including the rancher's wife who'd brought the cake pan and 2 younger women who'd sent gifts. They crowded into the small cabin, bringing flowers and pins and the veil that had been Mrs. Morrison's grandmother's. "You didn't think we'd let you prepare alone, did you?" Mrs. Morrison asked, already fussing with Hazel's hair. "Weddings require witnesses, assistants, and considerable bossiness. Fortunately, I excel at all 3. The women worked with efficient kindness, pinning Hazel's hair into something resembling elegance, arranging the veil, adding the flowers. They chatted about their own weddings, about the ranch, about recipes they wanted Hazel to share sometime. They treated her like one of them, like a woman getting married was normal, expected, celebrated. "There, Mrs. Morrison said finally, stepping back. "Beautiful. Don't argue," she added when Hazel opened her mouth. "You're beautiful because you're loved, and you're brave. And today, everyone gets to see it." They walked together to the spot Dutch and Samuel had prepared, a clearing near the cottonwood grove where Hazel had once sat with Rowan and watched the mountains. The arbor stood decorated with so many wildflowers it looked like something from a fairy tale. Chairs had been arranged in rows. Not many, because this was a small gathering, but enough. The men from the ranch sat in the front, cleaned up and dressed in their best, looking uncomfortable but determined to do this right. And at the front, standing beside the arbor, was Rowan. He wore a new suit, dark and formal, and his hair was combed back and his jaw freshly shaved. But what stopped Hazel's breath was his expression. He was looking at her like she was the only person in the world, like she was everything he'd ever wanted, like he couldn't quite believe his luck. Dutch stood up when he saw her, and the other men followed suit. Hazel walked down the makeshift aisle on Mrs. Morrison's arm since her father was gone and the old woman had insisted on giving her away. With each step, she felt the weight of old shame trying to pull her back, trying to convince her this couldn't be real. But then she looked at Rowan, and his face told her everything she needed to know. This was real. He was choosing her, and she was choosing him back. The ceremony was performed by a circuit preacher who'd arrived that morning and would leave that afternoon. He kept it simple, the traditional words about love and commitment and forsaking all others. When he asked if anyone objected, Quinn Stage whispered, "Anyone objects, they answer to us." And the whole gathering laughed, breaking the formality into something warmer. Then it was time for vows. The preacher nodded at Rowan. Rowan took Hazel's hands, and his voice was steady, carrying to everyone present. "Hazel Boone, 6 months ago you knocked on my door looking for work, and I hired you because I needed someone who could cook. I got so much more than that. I got someone who taught 20 rough men that kindness isn't weakness, someone who ran into a blizzard to save a child, someone who worked 4 days straight to keep my men alive, someone who showed me that real love isn't about perfection, it's about showing up every day and doing the work." He paused, his eyes bright. "I'm not good with pretty words, but I promise you this. I'll show up. I'll do the work. I'll choose you every single day for the rest of my life, and I'll wash the dishes, because that's when you're most yourself. When you're taking something that was used and making it clean and ready to be used again." That's what you've done for me. Made me clean. Made me ready to be used for something good. Hazel's vision blurred with tears. The preacher nodded at her, and she took a shaking breath. Rowan Cade, I came here expecting nothing but work. I'd resigned myself to a life alone, to being useful but not loved. You saw through that. You saw worth I couldn't see in myself. You defended me when no one else would. You gave me work and purpose and safety, but more than that, you gave me hope. Her voice cracked. I don't have pretty words either, but I promise you this. I'll feed you. I'll feed this ranch. I'll feed every dream we build together with the same care I put into every meal I've ever made. Because feeding someone is how I show love, and I love you more than I knew it was possible to love anyone. The preacher smiled. By the power vested in me by the territory of Wyoming and the grace of God, I pronounce you husband and wife. Rowan, kiss your bride before she changes her mind. Rowan laughed and pulled Hazel close, kissing her thoroughly while the gathering erupted in cheers and applause, and Thompson's harmonica playing something that might have been celebratory if he'd hit the right notes. When they finally broke apart, Hazel was laughing and crying simultaneously, and Rowan was looking at her like she'd hung the moon. Mrs. Cade, he said, testing the name. That's going to take some getting used to. We've got time. We've got the rest of our lives. The reception that followed was chaotic and perfect. The men had actually managed to prepare food that was edible, roast beef that was only slightly burnt, potatoes that were mostly cooked, biscuits that were hard enough to use as weapons but made up for it in quantity. Mrs. Morrison's friends had contributed pies that were genuine perfection, and Hazel's cornbread and cream sauce, which Dutch had somehow managed to make following her exact instructions, was devoured within minutes. People ate and drank weak punch and danced to Thompson's harmonica and a fiddle someone had brought. Dutch gave a speech that made everyone laugh and then cry when he talked about how Hazel had saved his life during the fever. Quinn presented them with a carved wooden sign that read, Cade Ranch, home of the best damn food in Wyoming. Samuel, true to his quiet nature, simply handed Hazel a small box containing seeds for her kitchen garden, practical and thoughtful. As evening fell and people began to leave, making their way home before full dark, Hazel found herself standing with Rowan at the edge of the celebration, watching their guests depart. Happy? He asked quietly. Terrified. Happy. Both. She leaned against him. Is it always going to feel this big? This overwhelming? Probably not. Eventually it'll just feel normal. We'll wake up married and it'll be ordinary. He smiled. But I hope we never stop appreciating that we found each other, that we were both broken enough to recognize healing when we saw it. They stood in the gathering darkness, and Hazel thought about everything that had led to this moment, all the years of hurt and shame, her father's death, the lonely winters, the desperate attempt to survive, the knock on her door that had changed everything. Rowan? She said quietly. Thank you. For what? For seeing me. For choosing me. For making me believe I was worth choosing. He turned her to face him, his hands gentle on her shoulders. Hazel, I need you to understand something. I didn't make you worth anything. You were always worth everything. I just had the good sense to recognize it. He kissed her forehead. Now come on. Let's go home. Home. The words settled in her chest like warmth, like bread rising, like something that had always been meant to exist but needed the right conditions to grow. They walked back to the main house together, past the kitchen where Hazel had spent 6 months building a life from flour and care, past the cabin with the green door where she'd first allowed herself to hope, toward the bedroom they'd now share as husband and wife. Behind them, the ranch settled into its evening rhythms. Cattle lowed in the distance. Horses shifted in the barn. The last of the wedding guests departed with waves and well wishes, and in the kitchen, waiting for morning, was everything Hazel needed to begin another day of feeding the people who'd become her family. The summer that followed was full in ways Hazel had never experienced. Full of work, certainly. The ranch didn't stop needing her cooking just because she'd gotten married, but also full of small joys she'd never allowed herself before. Rowan's hand finding hers across the dinner table. The way he'd sometimes appear behind her while she was working and wrap his arms around her waist, pressing a kiss to her neck before returning to ranch duties. The quiet mornings when they'd wake before dawn and just lie together, talking about nothing and everything, building intimacy from shared breath and whispered confessions. The men had quickly learned to knock before entering the kitchen, after walking in on the newlyweds kissing enthusiastically against the counter one Tuesday morning. Dutch had backed out so fast he'd nearly tripped over his own feet, muttering about needing to be blind for the next hour. Rowan had just laughed and said, "Probably should have locked the door." Hazel had been too embarrassed to speak for an hour. But beyond the romance, beyond the adjustment to married life, something else was growing. Hazel had started keeping a journal. Nothing fancy, just a ledger where she recorded recipes and observations about cooking. But gradually, it evolved into something more. She started writing about the philosophy behind feeding people, about how food could be medicine for more than just the body, about techniques she'd developed for making a little stretch to feed many, about the relationship between nourishment and love. One evening in late July, Rowan found her at the kitchen table, writing by lamplight long after the dinner dishes were done. "What are you working on?" he asked, reading over her shoulder. "Just thoughts about cooking, about what it means to feed people who are hungry for more than food." He read silently for a moment. Then he said, "Hazel, this is good, really good. You should share it." "Share it how? It's just my rambling." "It's wisdom. And there are women, probably men too, all over this territory who could benefit from it." He sat down across from her. "What if you taught people? Started teaching other women how to cook the way you do? Not just following recipes, but understanding the why behind it." Hazel stared at him. "I'm not a teacher. I'm just a cook." "You're the keeper. You're the woman who taught 20 rough cowboys that being fed well means being valued. If you can teach them, you can teach anyone." The idea took root slowly, like seeds planted in late summer. Hazel started small. When Mrs. Morrison mentioned that her granddaughter was struggling to feed her new husband on limited resources, Hazel invited her to the kitchen for an afternoon. She taught the young woman how to make soup that could stretch for days, how to bake bread that would stay fresh, how to season with confidence rather than fear. Word spread. Other women started asking. By September, Hazel was teaching a small group every Saturday afternoon, ranch wives and young brides, and even a few men who'd been widowed and needed to learn self-sufficiency. She taught them techniques, yes, but more than that, she taught them that feeding people was an act of power, of love, of quiet revolution. "You're making something that matters," Rowan told her one night as they lay in bed, her back against his chest, his arm around her waist. "You're changing how people think about food, about care, about what it means to show up for the people you love. I'm just sharing what I know. That's what teaching is, and you're good at it because you understand what it's like to go without. Not just food, but care, attention, love." He pressed a kiss to her shoulder. "You're giving people tools to survive, but more than that, you're giving them permission to believe survival can include joy." In October, as the world prepared for winter again, Hazel received a letter that changed everything. It was from a publisher in Chicago who'd somehow heard about her work, probably through Mrs. Morrison, who'd apparently been corresponding with her daughter in the city about the remarkable cook at Cade Ranch. The letter proposed something audacious. A cookbook, yes, but more than that. A book about the philosophy of feeding people, about survival and love and the quiet power of showing up every day to do the work. They wanted her wisdom, her recipes, her story. Hazel brought the letter to Rowan with shaking hands. "This can't be real. Publishers don't write to ranch cooks in Wyoming." He read it carefully, then looked at her with an expression of fierce pride. "They do when the cook is extraordinary, when she's got something worth saying." He handed back the letter. "What do you want to do?" "I don't know. Writing a book feels big, overwhelming. Everything worth doing is overwhelming at first, but you've done overwhelming things before. You survived alone for 2 years. You saved 10 men from fever. You married a stubborn rancher and made him believe in love again." He smiled. "Writing a book is just another impossible thing you're going to make possible." "You really think I can do this?" "Hazel." He waited until she met his eyes. "You can do anything. You've already proven that. The only question is whether you believe it yet. She did, or at least she was starting to. That night, she wrote back to the publisher and said yes. The winter that followed was different from the one before. Hazel still cooked, still fed the ranch, still taught her Saturday classes. But now, in the evenings after dishes were done, she wrote. She wrote about her father teaching her that dignity came from how you treated what little you had. She wrote about the first breakfast she'd made at Cade Ranch and the terrifying joy of watching men eat like they'd forgotten food could taste like care. She wrote about running into a blizzard for a child who wasn't hers. She wrote about standing in a dance hall and refusing to accept cruelty as her due. She wrote about falling in love with a man who saw her worth before she could see it herself. Rowan would sit with her while she worked, sometimes reading, sometimes just watching the fire, sometimes falling asleep in his chair, only to wake when she finally closed her journal and suggested they go to bed. He never complained about the time it took, never suggested her cooking was more important than her writing. He understood somehow that this book was her way of processing everything she'd survived and everything she'd become. Spring arrived again, as it always did, with the persistence of hope. The manuscript was finished, sent off to Chicago in a package that felt impossibly light for something that held her entire story. The publisher wrote back enthusiastic responses, talking about editing and printing and distribution. It felt unreal, like something happening to someone else. But then, on a Tuesday morning in April, exactly 1 year after Caroline had arrived and been sent away, a package arrived at the ranch. Inside were 5 copies of a book with Hazel's name on the cover. The Keeper's Kitchen, on Feeding, Love, and the Courage to Show Up, by Hazel Boone Cade. She stood in the yard holding one copy, staring at her name printed in real ink, and couldn't quite believe it was real. Rowan came out of the barn, saw what she was holding, and let out a whoop that brought every man running. "The book came!" Quinn shouted. "Let me see it!" They crowded around, these rough men who'd been fed and healed and taught that they mattered, and they looked at Hazel's book like it was made of gold. Dutch opened it carefully and started reading the dedication aloud. "For the men who taught me that feeding someone is how you show them they're worth keeping alive. For the women who are learning that their care is their power. For everyone who's ever felt too much, too little, too broken to deserve love. You are enough. You have always been enough. May you find someone who feeds your soul the way you've learned to feed others." The yard was quiet. Then Thompson pulled out his harmonica and played something that might have been triumphant, and everyone laughed, breaking the emotion into celebration. That evening, Hazel and Rowan sat together on the bench near the Cottonwood Grove, the same place they'd sat a year ago when he'd told her about Caroline, when he'd chosen substance over surface. The mountains were purple in the distance. The ranch was settling into its evening peace. In Hazel's lap was her book, real and solid and proof that impossible things were only impossible until someone did them. "How does it feel?" Rowan asked. "Being a published author? Surreal. Terrifying, like at any moment someone's going to realize they made a mistake." She paused. "But also right. Like this was what I was supposed to do all along and I just needed time to become brave enough to do it." "You were always brave. You just needed someone to point it out. And you needed someone to feed you properly." She smiled. "I think we saved each other. Best deal I ever made." He pulled her close, and they sat watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and pink and purple. 6 months later, Hazel received another letter from the publisher. The book was selling beyond expectations. Women across the country were writing to say it had changed how they thought about cooking, about care, about their own worth. The publisher wanted to discuss a second book. This one focused specifically on teaching cooking techniques to women with limited resources. Hazel's Saturday classes had grown too large for the ranch kitchen. The men had built a separate building, half classroom, half kitchen, where she now taught groups of 15 or 20 women at a time. Some traveled for days to attend. They came from ranches and towns, wealthy and poor, young and old. They came because they'd heard about the fat girl who'd become the keeper, who'd married the rancher, who'd written a book that told them their care mattered. And Hazel taught them how to make bread rise and soup stretch and tough meat tender. But more than that, she taught them that showing up every day to feed the people you loved was a quiet form of revolution. that care was power, that being needed was a form of being valued. One Saturday in late autumn, a young woman stayed after class. She was maybe 18, heavy-set, with eyes that held the wariness of someone who'd been hurt for how she looked. She approached Hazel hesitantly. "Miss Hazel, Mrs. Cade, I just wanted to say, I read your book, and it made me cry. Because I'd never heard anyone say that being big didn't mean being worthless, that you could be loved anyway." Hazel's throat tightened. She remembered being that age, believing she'd never be chosen, never be wanted. "You're not loved anyway," she said gently. "You're loved because of everything you are. Your size is just one part of a whole person, and anyone who can't see past it isn't worth your time. But how do you believe that, when everyone tells you different? You start by feeding yourself the way you'd feed someone you loved, with care, with attention, with the understanding that you deserve good things." Hazel paused. "And then you find people who see your worth, maybe just one person at first. You let them reflect back to you what you can't see yet, and gradually you start to believe it." The young woman nodded, tears on her cheeks. "Thank you for showing me it's possible." After she left, Hazel stood in the empty classroom and thought about Mrs. Morrison saying that her story mattered, that girls needed to see someone like her succeed. She hadn't understood then, not fully, but she understood now. Every woman she taught, every person who read her book, every life touched by the simple message that care was valuable. They were proof that survival could become more than just endurance. It could become legacy. The years that followed were full in the best ways. Hazel wrote her second book, then a third. The ranch thrived, known across the territory not just for quality cattle, but for the food served in its dining hall, so good that people would ride for miles just to eat there. Hazel and Rowan built an addition to the main house specifically so they could host people who came for the weekend cooking courses that had evolved from the Saturday classes. They never had children, whether by choice or circumstance, they never said. But they had something just as valuable. They had a ranch full of men who'd been taught that care mattered. They had students who carried Hazel's lessons back to their own kitchens and families. They had a legacy of books that taught people survival wasn't just about staying alive, but about finding reasons to want to keep living. Dutch grew old on the ranch, eventually retiring to a small cabin they built for him where he could sit on the porch and complain about young people while carving small wooden animals for visiting children. Quinn married a girl from Clearmont and had 4 daughters, all of whom learned to cook from Hazel. Samuel never remarried, but he became the ranch foreman and was known for his fair management and his complete intolerance for anyone who disrespected women. Thompson's daughter came to visit and ended up staying, reconciling with her father and learning to play harmonica well enough that she didn't make ears bleed. Mrs. Morrison lived to be 93, cantankerous and beloved to the end. She told anyone who'd listened that she'd known from the first moment that Hazel Boone would be someone special, conveniently forgetting that she'd needed convincing at the dance. When she died, she left Hazel her grandmother's wedding ring, the one that had been in the family for generations, with a note that said simply, "Pass it on to someone who understands that worth comes from courage." Joseph Standing Bear and his grandson Makwa visited every summer, bringing gifts and stories, and the reminder that kindness across differences mattered more than prejudice. Makwa grew into a young man who became a teacher himself, working to bridge the gap between the Lakota community and the white settlers who'd displaced them. He credited Hazel with showing him that there were white people who'd choose compassion over convenience, who'd risk their lives for strangers. And through it all, Hazel cooked. She fed the ranch hands who came and went, each generation learning from her. She fed the students who attended her classes. She fed Rowan, who never stopped washing dishes beside her in the evenings, who never stopped looking at her like she was the best thing that had ever happened to him. On their 20th anniversary, sitting together on their bench near the cottonwood grove, Rowan said, "Do you ever think about how different your life could have been if I hadn't knocked on your door that day?" Hazel considered this. "Sometimes. But then I think about how that version of me, alone in that cabin, slowly disappearing, she wasn't really living. She was just surviving, and survival's important, but it's not enough." "What is enough?" "This." She gestured at the ranch. at the life they'd built. Being seen, being chosen, having work that matters and people to share it with, knowing that I fed more than just bodies. I fed souls. I fed hope. She looked at him. Being loved by you, that's enough. That's everything. Rowan pulled her close, and they sat in the gathering darkness. Two people who'd found each other across all the ways they'd been broken and built something whole from the fragments. Years later, when Hazel was old and her hands were too arthritic to knead bread the way she once had, she would sit in her kitchen, the one that had been expanded 3 times to accommodate all the teaching and cooking and living that happened there, and watch younger women work. She'd give advice, share stories, and occasionally fall asleep in her chair by the fire, content in the knowledge that she'd done what she'd set out to do. She'd shown up. She'd done the work. She'd fed everyone who needed feeding, whether they needed food or hope or the simple understanding that they mattered. And on the wall above the massive stove, in a frame that had been there for decades, hung a small embroidered piece of fabric. Green cloth with careful stitching that read, "The Keeper of Home's Taste." It had been a gift from the men that first summer, and Hazel had kept it through everything that followed, through joy and sorrow, through success and struggle, through every moment of a life that had started with shame and transformed into purpose. Because that's what she'd become. Not just a cook, not just a wife, not just an author or teacher. She'd become the keeper of something more important than all of those things. She'd kept alive the knowledge that every person who sat at a table deserved to be fed with care, that every meal was an opportunity to show someone they mattered, that love could be baked into bread and stirred into soup and served with the simple statement, "I see you, I choose you. You are worth keeping alive." And beneath the vast Wyoming sky, in the kitchen that smelled eternally of bread and possibility, Hazel Boone Cade had proven that the fat girl by the river could become a woman who fed the West, not just with food, but with the radical notion that everyone, regardless of size or shape or past wounds, deserved a seat at the table. She'd shown them what real love tasted like. And the world had been hungry enough to feast,